Hi everyone, we hope you're doing well. We're hanging in there though honestly, we haven't been getting much sleep lately. Today, we want to answer a question we get a lot: how do we publish our audiobooks? First, we post most audiobooks on Patreon as paid content. They stay paid for a few months. After that, they become free to listen to on Patreon forever. A few weeks later, we post them on other places like YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, X. Lately, things have been a bit slow in terms of new members. So we'd love your help. Please share our site with your friends or in places like Facebook groups, Twitter, X, Discord, Reddit, or novel forums. Even one share can really help us grow. Thanks so much for your support, where he immediately began to unleash his laser repeaters and plasma cannon onto their backsides, blowing them out of the sky one by one. With the 6 enemy fighters terminated, Eric then waited for his allies to show up, where they noticed he was all alone, cruising in the sky as if he was enjoying a brief stroll. Immediately he was harassed over the comms by his fellow pilots who demanded to know where the 6 hostiles were at. So where are they? I came all this way, and you're just cruising through the air? What the fuck happened? Eric simply smirked, which was concealed beneath his visor's holographic projection, before responding in a conceited tone. You guys took too long, they're already dead. Eliminating 6 enemy fighters by ourselves was no easy task. Even if they were far more primitive than the ones the Germanic Star Empire made use of. 6 fighters armed with cold fusion missiles, and railguns were still able to destroy a bolt interceptor if they coordinated their attacks effectively. Yet, they were all smoldering wrecks on the surface below, while Eric appeared to be entirely unharmed. This caused the members of his squadron to look at him with a degree of respect, which they had not afforded him until now. Thus, it came as a bit of a surprise when they complimented Eric for his feats. Goddamn, Silver. Way to go, kid. With these 6 hostiles eliminated, Eric would work alongside the 2 other fighters to conduct their atmospheric operations until the banner of the Germanic Star Empire was waving proudly over the planet's surface. Though a month had already gone by since the beginning of the war, less than a quarter of the planets under the control of the Dvrakian Consortium had fallen to the Germanic Star Empire. The fact that they were uncontested in space, and yet they had still only conquered a handful of worlds, led Eric to believe that although the Germanic Star Empire's military might was impeccable, they did not have the manpower necessary to conquer an empire that spanned across several hundred star systems without spending considerable time and effort to do so. Something which he felt needed to be corrected in his people's future efforts to expand across the galaxy. Chapter 25, The Battle of the Bloody Gulch. Another 3 months passed by as the war between the Germanic Star Empire and the Dvrakian Consortium reached new levels of intensity. While the Dvrakian armed forces had resorted to mass conscription of its male population, as well as breaking open old storehouses filled with centuries-old weapons to engage with the enemy, the Germanic military seemed fresh, and undeterred. As if each battle was a chance to prove themselves as a warrior to which their society revered above all other pursuits in life. The war was recorded by the Germanic media, who proudly displayed the gruesome scenes to its population, as a proof of the strength that their empire possessed. With each passing hour, new footage from the Dvrakian worlds which were under siege was spread across the empire, and in doing so igniting the nationalism that its people felt. Currently, one of the most popular reporters in the empire, who was a relatively young woman by the name of Hedda Anderson, was on board the carrier which housed Eric and his comrades. She was going throughout the ship while interviewing soldiers on their thoughts about the war, and just so happened to come into contact with Eric, who had just climbed out of the showers, while wearing nothing but a towel. He was headed back to his bunk to change into a flight suit in preparation for his shift when he was ambushed by the reporter. Something which he did not take kindly to. A group of small cameras orbited around Eric like a flight of dragonflies, filming his appearance for the entire empire to see, where Hedda immediately asked him a question which he was not prepared to answer. You there? Mutant. What role do you fulfill on this carrier? Eric's expression immediately turned sour as his image was filmed and broadcasted across the empire, where he then answered the reporter with a rather cold tone in his voice. I'm a fighter pilot. Now, if you will excuse me, I have to get ready for my shift. The woman was not deterred by Eric's response, and kept pressing him for an interview, which only further got on the man's nerves. Just a moment of your time is all I ask, and your thoughts regarding the war? When Eric heard this question, he scoffed at the very notion. He had spent the last 4 years, spending 20 hours a day in nothing but combat. What did he think of this war? What an absurd question to ask. And who in their right mind wanted to hear what a combatant thought about the war they waged? He was visibly upset by the question, something which the cameras buzzing around his face only further added to, and thus, he responded with a rather vicious tone in his voice as he spoke the honest truth. You want to know what my thoughts are about the war? Okay, fine, here's what I think, and every other poor soul who has the misfortune of flying a starfighter. We have to work 20-hour shifts every single day. We get a 30-minute lunch break, and just enough time to shower and brush our teeth so that we maintain proper hygiene. Other than that, our life is nothing but combat. In order to cope with the overwhelming fatigue which occurs about 12 hours into our shifts, High Command has decided it would be a brilliant idea to pump all of its pilots full adrenals, so that we maintain peak performance for our shifts. Then, after I have spent the last 20 hours fighting for my life, I get to come back to my bunk, only to find that 12 other people have slept in it over the past 24 hours. By the time I wake up, I am covered in the sweat, blood, and tears of a dozen other men, where I proceed to take a shower, to which I am accompanied by twice as many men. After I finish cleaning the muck and grime off of my body, I make my way back to my bunk to prepare for my next shift, which by the way has someone else sleeping in it, only to be harassed by a reporter who wants to know something as stupid about what my thoughts are on this war. Now that you know my thoughts, how about you get those fucking cameras out of my goddamn face? After saying this, Eric took a swipe at the cameras, and knocked them down onto the ground, where they were dismantled by the impact. The image of the silver-haired mutant lashing out at the female reporter who was just doing her job, went about as viral as one would expect it to, especially after people realized that the man in the video was the same guy who just a year ago had caused so many controversies at the Naval Academy. All over the grid, angry comments about Eric's behavior spread like wildfire, burying those concerns about the living conditions that the starfighter pilots were forced to endure. And while there were many people upset with Eric's behavior, the most unlikely source of reason came to support him. Having just finished a performance for her girl group, Erica Krieger took to the Interstellar network during her break, where she saw the video of the man whose life she had once ruined snapping at a female reporter. It was abundantly clear to the pink-haired beauty that the man was suffering from extreme amounts of stress, which judging by what he had said during his brief interview was only made worse by the chemicals which the military was pumping through his body so that he could maintain his focus on the battlefield, which she was quick to give voice to via her social media account. So many people are quick to condemn this man for his actions. However, how many of you have ever been in his shoes? As far as I am aware, the military has never forced its pilots to work 20-hour shifts for months on end. This is unprecedented. While our species has been enhanced through centuries of genetic augmentation, we still require more than 2 hours of sleep to function properly. I can't imagine the sheer volume of stress and fatigue that our servicemen are currently enduring, all because the Admiralty is pushing for a swift victory against an enemy which poses no threat to our borders. After 4 months of non-stop combat, I too would be on edge, especially if I were ambushed by a reporter when I am half naked and trying to begin my next shift, where I could die at any moment. Our soldiers deserve better than this. Shame on Mrs. Anderson for forcing an interview out of a man who clearly did not want to participate. Erica's comments quickly washed out the fire which was raging across the Interstellar network, and instead placated the masses who were quite upset over Eric's behavior. As for Eric, he did not even notice that his actions had caused another controversy, because he was too busy flying over the skies of another world, dropping a substantial payload on the enemy. In 4 months, Eric had proven himself as one of the most talented young pilots in the Germanic Starfighter Corps, so much so that he qualified to fly several types of spacecraft. Whether that was the basic light fighter known as the Dagger, or the high-speed interceptor known as the Bolt, Eric performed well in all roles he was given. Thus, it did not come as a surprise when he was selected to step in on behalf of the other members of his unit, who had perished in battle, and were currently recuperating in a cloning facility several hundred light-years away from the front lines. At the moment, Eric was flying a heavy bomber designated as the Scimitar, which looked like a futuristic version of the B-2 Spirit bomber from the United States Air Force during the 21st century of Earth's history. Like the B-2, the Scimitar had stealth capabilities, and thus the sensors of the Dvrakian military could not detect him as he flew through the skies of a world known as Skian. The world was a winter wasteland, of which the Dvrakian species only managed to settle its surface via the use of subterranean bunkers. And while the Star Marines were currently engaging on the surface of the snow-covered world, Eric was tasked with dropping an antimatter bomb on a nearby shield generator. If he managed to eliminate the shield generator, then the defenses which protected the subterranean complexes would be all but defenseless against the onslaught of the Germanic military, who despite their superior technology, were struggling in their assault. The bomber flew through the air at breakneck speeds while Eric looked through his windshields, gazing upon the battle which was being conducted below. In the snow, which looked almost like white sand dunes, the Germanic Star Marines rushed towards a Dvrakian fortress, as their power armor and personal energy shields tanked the electromagnetic projectiles which the enemy fired upon them. There was approximately 15 kilometers of distance between the Germanic armored vehicles which acted as a cover for the Star Marines, and the Dvrakian fortress, which was protected by the shield generator. If not for the shield generated, which protected the Dvrakian stronghold, then the Germanic tanks would have steamrolled through the area hours ago. What emerged through after hours of battle was a gulch which sat between both sides, and was filled with the corpses of both armies. While the Germanic automatic plasma rifles tore through the primitive body armor of their enemies with ease, the railguns which the Dvrakians used slowly pierced through the power armor and energy shields which the Star Marines wielded. And while the pile of corpses was heavily dominated by those of the Dvrakian army, more than a few bodies belonged to the Star Marines. Sensing that the battle was turning into a stalemate, with both sides hiding behind their cover and exchanging fire between the bloody gulch, Eric desperately scanned his surroundings with his sensors, searching for his target, which had yet to reveal itself. After significant effort on his part, he eventually found a large structure, concealed within the natural frozen landscape, to which he immediately ignited his engines, sending his scimitar barreling towards its target where once hovering above it, he dropped the payload, before absconding from the scene of his crime. The explosion of a 1,000-kilogram antimatter bomb was like those that were dropped upon Nagasaki and Hiroshima, but without the radioactive fallout, and because of this, the two armies that were fighting several hundred kilometers away had witnessed the mushroom cloud as it rose through the air, along with the accompanying thunder of the weapon's detonation. Almost immediately after the explosion occurred, the shockwaves spread throughout the tundra, creating a pseudo-avalanche which buried both armies beneath the snow, and while the soldiers of Germanic Star Empire dug their way out of the mess, the Dvrakians were buried alive with no way out. The end result of the bloody battle which took place in the Bloody Gulch was an overwhelming Germanic victory, as the Star Marines secured the area and eliminated what few of their enemies survived, giving them a substantial foothold on the frozen world to which they would begin their conquest. As for Eric, he was ordered almost immediately after the successful completion of his mission to return to the carrier which sat in orbit above the planet, where he would receive a verbal thrashing from his superior officer for the interview he had given to the female reporter. Chapter 26. All in. Eric stood on board the flight deck of the carrier which he served on. Standing in front of him was none other than Commander Erwin Wolf, who was absolutely livid with Eric for the actions he had taken during the brief interview he had with the field reporter known as Hedda Anderson. Like everyone else in this conflict, Erwin was being pushed beyond the natural limits of his body and mind with no way to vent his stress but through the excessive use of tobacco, and by killing the enemy on the battlefield. As a result, he instinctively took advantage of this situation to vent the frustrations he had with his daily life on the first member of his unit to act out in the eyes of the public. The man was smoking a cigarette, as was Eric, as he took a long drag before puffing out the smoke in his subordinate's face. An act which Eric simply tolerated, while wearing a stoic expression on his face, waiting for the eventual eruption that his commander would have. Which came soon thereafter. What the fuck were you thinking, Silver? You can't just assault a reporter like that. Especially when you are being broadcasted to the rest of the Empire. For fuck's sake, if you really have to knock some sense into the dense cunt, then do so when you aren't being filmed, you fucking mongoloid. These fucking interviews are supposed to fill the people back home with hope about the current conflict which we are waging. And your retarded ass decided to go ahead and reveal that we are all a bunch of chem-addled junkies who are being forced to fight all day long. I know your monkey brain didn't stop to think about this, but that reflects poorly on the Admiralty. Do you have any idea about the firestorm you have started on the grid because of your actions? Half of the people are pissed at you for lashing out against that fucking bitch, and the other half are now questioning the government for what they are doing to us. It doesn't help that the Supreme Leader is off on an extended visit to the Alphaim Dominion, along with the rest of the senior leadership of the party. The Admiral in charge of the fleet wants me to revoke the Iron Cross that I am supposed to give you for your feats at Thyricals, but I told him he can suck a bag of dicks, because you more than earned it. 100 enemy fighters shot down in a single battle, that's some damn good fucking flying, kid, so take this stupid piece of metal and wear it with pride, because at this rate you have made the Admiral's shit list, and you likely won't be seeing another award for the rest of your career. Eric was astonished that the commander could both chew his ass out, and tongue it at the same time. He took the medal which was given to him and observed it closely. It was nearly identical to the Iron Cross First Class, which was issued to German soldiers during the Second World War of Earth's history. Although the swastika in the center had been replaced with the black sun, which was the symbol emblazoned on the Germanic Star Empire's flag. After looking at the medal for some time, Eric smiled and stashed it away for later use during a time when he was required to wear his dress uniform. After which, the commander looked at him as if he were an imbecile before screaming at him once more. Well, what the fuck are you waiting for? We have a war to win. With this said, Eric raised his arm and saluted his commander, before repeating the battle cry that so many other Germanic soldiers shouted. Hail victory! After saying this, he dashed off towards his scimitar bomber and climbed into its cockpit before flying down towards the frozen planet known as Skian, where he then continued his bombing campaign against the Dvrakian army who struggled to maintain their hold over the world. After his 22-hour shift was over, Eric returned to his bunk with a cigarette in his mouth. He had stripped entirely out of his flight suit and into his compression shorts before even stepping into his quarters. He was just about to climb into the grimy bed which he shared with 12 other men via a rotation of sleeping shifts, when he saw a light was on in a small corner of the room. Curious about what was going on, Eric walked over to the light and found that several of his fellow pilots were engaging in an illegal gambling match, where they were betting their share of contraband, smuggled off of the Dvrakian worlds and into the fleet. As a pilot in the Starfighter Corps, Eric was obligated to report any misconduct he might have towards his superiors, but after 4 months of non-stop combat he could not care any less about regulations, and thus, he pulled out a chair and sat down at the table, to which one of his fellow Black Sun pilots smiled and welcomed him to their little game. Silver. I never thought I would see you of all people join us. If you've got contraband, then you are more than welcome to play your hand. Don't tell me you came to us empty-handed? Eric was more confused about why his fellow pilots were not getting the little sleep they were permitted to have and were instead wasting their time with gambling. Which he was quick to ask about. Why aren't you guys sleeping? I mean, even pumped full of stims, I can barely get through the day without taking out my service pistol and blowing a hole in my head. The 4 men chuckled, before one of them handed Eric a small bottle of blood-red liquid, to which he responded to Eric with a playful tone in his voice. Go ahead, drink it. I promise you that it is not what you think it is. Eric took one gulp of the liquid and felt like his mouth was on fire. He quickly handed the bottle back while coughing up a lung. To which his fellow pilots all began to laugh before the man who gave him the beverage in the first place responded. That's Dvrakian fire whiskey, has a bit of a kick, doesn't it? You see, from what my friends in the Star Marines tell me, the Dvrakians have 2 livers, meaning it takes a hell of a lot more alcohol to get those bastards drunk than it does us, even without the physical enhancements we have. I have no idea what the hell this shit is made out of, but one shot will put you under the table. I'm surprised you're still sitting upright. Eric could barely register what the man had said, because he felt like he had just been hit in the head with a sledgehammer. His fatigued body wanted nothing more than to pass out, but the adrenaline which flowed in his veins as a result of 22 hours of combat, and stimulants, prevented him from doing so. Thus, after nearly 5 minutes had passed, he finally regained his senses, and yet, he felt like all the fatigue which he had accumulated over the past 4 months was instantly washed away from his body, as if he had been born anew. He looked at the fellow pilot with a new sense of clarity before asking the immediate question on his mind. Vector? Just how the hell do I get my hands on a bottle of that shit? To which the man whose call sign was Vector smiled before pulling out the bottle which Eric had just drank from, and placed it on the table for all the men to see. Beat me in a game of cards, and the bottle is yours. How about it, Silver? Did you manage to get your hands on some loot that is worth my bottle of fire whiskey? Possession of contraband of any kind was strictly prohibited, and punished quite severely if discovered. However, Eric just couldn't help himself, and had indeed found some valuable contraband on the Dvrakian network which could easily land him with 10 to 20 years in a penal battalion. Seeing that all the men here were betting illicit items, Eric felt more comfortable revealing his precious secret and thus walked over to his bunk and pulled out a small drive no bigger than the tip of his thumb, where he placed it on the table before speaking the words that nobody expected. 250 yottabytes of Dvrakian porn ripped straight from their interstellar network. If you manage to win, it is all yours, and if I might make a recommendation, I suggest that you use it during your bathroom breaks to release some of your pent-up stress. The 4 men looked at Eric with a mixture of excitement, horror, and intrigue. They did not know how to react to such information, and remained utterly silent, debating whether or not they should bet for such a rare, and priceless artifact, one which could easily ruin their lives if it was discovered in their possession. It was not until Vector finally spoke did the tension in the air finally cease, and when he did, he said something that nobody at the table was expecting to hear. Damn, Silver, I didn't know you were a slicer. Shit, if you can get your hands on something this valuable, those idiots in the party should have put you to work in intelligence, instead of wasting your talents on being a fucking pilot. What the man said was true. Eric was what was known as a slicer, or in the slang from 21st century Earth, he would be referred to as a hacker. He was capable of bypassing the Great Firewall of the Germanic Star Empire and slicing into the networks of other civilizations. Depending on how he used this talent would either make him a valuable asset of the Empire, or a nasty thorn in its side. Most citizens of the Germanic Star Empire stayed within the legal confines of the grid, due to the strict penalties that came with slicing. But not Eric. No, he had always skirted on the edge of the law. Not an outright criminal, but also not a perfectly law-abiding citizen either. To Eric, slicing was a great way to get a better understanding of the galaxy, considering the strict limits that the Empire put on its own network. When the other pilots heard that Eric was a slicer, and was capable of hacking into the interstellar networks of other civilizations, they immediately became more interested in him. Thus, It came as no surprise when Vector suddenly pulled out his entire stock of the Dvrakian fire whiskey, and bet it all on a chance to obtain the sweet taboo of alien pornography. All in. Following his example, the other gamblers bet everything they had for a chance to see a bunch of Dvrakian girls in the nude, even if it was only on film. Where Eric emerged as the eventual winner of the pot. Having now gotten his hands on a literal treasure trove of contraband, Eric now felt like he would be better able to endure the stressful environment of non-stop combat. Chapter 27. The Gimdari Trade Union's representative arrives while the Germanic Star Empire was engaging in its war against the Dvrakian Consortium. The Alphaim Dominion had sortied its fleets, and had even called upon many of its vassals to come to their aid at their border with the Svartalfheim Federation. Celestia Asterion was the youngest daughter of the Light Elven Empress, yet she was chosen to be the crown princess of the Alphaim Dominion. Though she had yet to even reach 1,000 years of age, she was renowned across the western quadrant of the galaxy as a skilled admiral. Thus, she had been dispatched by her mother to the border which her dynasty shared with their darker-skinned cousins. Standing on the bridge of a megacarrier, which was over 10 kilometers in length, was the beautiful elven princess. Her long hair was as white as snow, while her eyes were as golden as the Earth's sun. Her skin was a flawless jade white, and her facial features were the absolute limit of perfection. The relatively young elven woman was dressed in a white, black and gold admiral's uniform, which had gilded epaulettes, and many prestigious medals adorned above the left breast. Her skirt was relatively short, while her pristine legs were concealed with dark pantyhose and thigh-high boots. While Celestia sat upon the command chair of her capital ship, she seemed rather bored, as if the tense situation at the border was not the slightest bit entertaining to her. Thus, she could not help but exclaim these feelings aloud, even if the rest of the officers on the bridge did not want to hear her complaints. I can't believe I'm stuck here at the border, instead of fighting the Naraka Hive fleet, which is terrorizing our quadrant of space. Damned dark elves. Who do they think they are, making trouble for us when we are in such a dire situation, and what the hell is Mother thinking allowing a mere regional power to fight against Terminus? I honestly can't tell what goes through that ancient brain of hers. Sitting in the seat near the captain's chair, was a Rylonian officer, who had joined the Alphaim Navy after the destruction of his civilization. Only a few million members of his species had survived the Hive fleet's attack on their civilization, and he had enlisted in the Alphaim Navy in the hopes of bringing the fight to the Naraku, but instead he was sitting at the border, while monitoring the activities of his suzerain's galactic rivals. Thus, he could empathize with the prince's viewpoint, while everyone else on the bridge ignored her complaints. Which he immediately gave voice to. Your Highness, though I agree with your assessment of the situation at hand, the Empress's orders are absolute. But like you say, I will never understand Her Majesty's obsession with those filthy barbarians. Celestia gazed upon the Rylonian bridge officer, who she just now realized held the rank of midshipman, and closely examined him. The Rylonians were an attractive humanoid species, with facial features similar to that of the Slavic race from Earth's history. However, they had an appearance considerably closer to that of albinos with pale white skin, matching hair, and glowing white eyes. Their ears were pointed, but not to the extent of elves, and they had bioluminescent markings across their flesh were almost akin to tattoos. Celestia could only sigh in lament, knowing that such an attractive race was damned near extinction, but the man's last words had caught her interest. Specifically, the remarks about the Germanic race being filthy barbarians. In truth, Celestia knew very little about the Germanic Star Empire other than the fact that they were a recent upstart in galactic civilization which her mother heavily favored. Until now, she had never heard the Rylonian perspective of the Germanic race, and was quick to ask the man about why he had called them such an insulting term. I'm curious, midshipman, you called the Germans filthy barbarians. That is quite the insult, and I want to know why you would refer to them by such a harsh term. The Rylonian officer had a look of contempt on his face, as he began to explain his disdain for the Germanic race, who had stolen the favor of the Empress which they once had before Lunaria had discovered the fledgling empire a mere 3.5 centuries ago. Is it not self-evident? The Germanic Star Empire commonly refers to themselves as a warrior race, yet they have no honor, nor the slightest shred of civility. When they wage war, they completely disregard the lives of innocents, and will exterminate entire worlds if the conquered subjects show the slightest bit of resistance after occupation. Every species which the Germanic Star Empire has conquered is eventually exterminated, because they believe all other species are inferior to their own. They have no regard for life outside of their own kind, and they show this in the way they conduct warfare. They are not warriors, they are a bunch of barbarians and butchers. I would even argue that the Germanic Star Empire is an even larger menace to galactic society than the Naraku, because the Naraku are mindless bugs. They act based upon pure biological instinct, while the Germans have proven themselves to be exceptionally intelligent, but absurdly unreasonable. The fact that the current Empress favors them so much is truly a concern for the well-being of all interstellar civilizations. Upon hearing this perspective, Celestia immediately began to rethink her disposition towards the Germanic Star Empire, that is, until a member of her own race who was another officer on the bridge scoffed, before voicing his own opinion towards the Germans. They're not that bad. I mean, sure, the Germans are highly xenophobic towards other species, but that is pretty much the norm within the galaxy. If I'm being perfectly honest, most of the propaganda which you see come out of the Germanic Star Empire is similar to what the Alphaean Dominion uses to rally its people. Liexels here is just upset that his civilization had been so thoroughly upstaged by the Germanic Star Empire shortly before the Rylonian Imperium collapsed. If I'm remembering correctly, it was your sense of honor in warfare that led to the last 50 defeats you guys suffered at the hands of the Svartalfheim Federation's proxies. Say what you want about the Germanic Star Empire, but to this day they have never been defeated in a war, and most of the time they have fought against civilizations superior to their own. That is why Her Majesty favors them so much. I mean hell, until roughly 100 years ago, the weapons which the Germanic Star Empire used were primarily mass drivers, and other kinetic-based weapons. The fact that the Germanic Star Empire was able to use such primitive devices to obtain victory against armies armed with far more advanced technology is proof that they are an incredibly valuable vessel, despite only existing as an interstellar civilization for less than half a millennium. Plus, I'm not going to lie. I find them to be far more attractive than you glowing freaks. You have to admit, they look quite similar to the average light elf, albeit substantially larger. It's almost as if one of the Empress biologically engineered their species from our own genes to be perfectly suitable for combat. I mean, the Asterian dynasty is renowned for their white hair and golden eyes, but the most common phenotype which our species has is golden blonde hair, and blue eyes, just like the Germans. The Rylonian officer whose name was Liexeles did not make a comment in response to the Light Elven officer's remarks. He simply scowled and remained silent. As for Celestia, she did not know whose perspective she should take to heart, and thus decided after this mission was over, that she would do a bit more research on the history of the Germanic Star Empire, who appeared to have a bright future ahead of them, assuming they somehow managed to survive the onslaught of the Naraka Hive fleet terminus. While Celestia was thinking about this subject, the sensors on board her megacarrier detected movement into the star system, which acted as the primary access point at the border between the western and eastern quadrants. To which she was quick to give an order to her fleet. Raise the shields and prepare for combat. It looks like those dark-skinned mongrels have decided to invade our borders after all. The officers on board the bridge quickly did as commanded, as the Alphaean fleet began to scramble its fighters into space in preparation for the upcoming battle. However, just when they were about to open fire on those who would intrude upon their borders, something interesting happened. A hailing frequency reached out to Celestia's ship, to which she begrudgingly accepted. On the holographic projection was a figure of a very small humanoid. By human standards, it would be considered a dwarf. The creature had long and pointy ears which drooped to the side and a hooked nose. He was incredibly fat for his size, and was dressed in rather luxurious attire. His dark beady eyes gazed upon Celestia's heavenly figure with a bit of lust within them, as his sharp teeth curved into a toothy smile before introducing himself to the Light Elven Princess. "Greetings, Your Highness, I am Trade Prince Bixel Goldentooth of the Gimdari Trade Union. I have been requested by representatives of both the Alphaean Dominion and the Svartalfheim Federation to mediate in the dispute between your two civilizations. If it is all right with you, I would like to get the Svartalfheim Federation's admiral on the line to negotiate an end to the hostilities which are clearly escalating between the both of you." Celestia scowled when she saw the hideous goblinoid creature. She despised the Gimdari race almost as much as the Dark Elves. They were a bunch of greedy merchants and bankers who had gained their fortune by infiltrating and swindling every interstellar civilization they came across. In fact, for a long time, the Gimdari did not even have their own home world, until they used their wealth to bribe one of the subgalactic powers to conquer an occupied world for them, which they then proceeded to spend the next few centuries ethically cleansing the locals. It had been millions of years since then, and currently, the Gimdari Trade Union effectively controlled the galactic economy. And while many civilizations considered it a mark of pride to host their banks and corporations within their borders, some, like the Germanic Star Empire, refused to do so. Most of these civilizations were wiped out via the influence the Gimdari Trade Union had over the galaxy and its many players. However, despite their best attempts to force the Germanic race into capitulation, the protection which Empress Lunaria Asterion of the Alphaean Dominion afforded her favorite warhounds, prevented the various trade princes from infiltrating and subverting Germanic society, like they had done to so many others. Perhaps her mother's constant complaints about the Gimdari Trade Union had affected her views, but Celestia hated the Gimdari race with a passion. Unfortunately, Lunaria had been forced to reach out these pathetic little runts in order to avoid an all-out war with the Svartalfheim Dominion, and thus Celestia could only sigh, and accept the bastard's request. Almost immediately after silently nodding her head, a dark elf's holographic projection appeared on the command bridge of Celestia's carrier alongside the Guy Trade Prince, who had a smug expression on his face as he spoke to Celestia as if she were a mere child. Did that old hag seriously send the little girl to protect her borders? My oh my, she must be going senile if she thinks it is a good idea to send you of all people to this battlefield. Just when Celestia was about to respond to this insult, Bixel shook his head and clicked his tongue in displeasure before shutting down the Dark Elf Admiral. TSK. Cronarius, that is entirely inappropriate for a discussion about decreasing hostilities. I will give you one warning before I contact my merchant fleet and discuss with them whether or not sanctions against the Svartalfheim Federation are in order. The idea of receiving economic sanctions from a trade prince of the Gindari Trade Union was enough to instantly silence the admiral of the Federation's fleet, and force him to apologize for his words. I am sorry, Mr. Golden Tooth. My words were an insult to you as our mediator, and I promise to keep such remarks to myself during the future of these discussions. Bixel's mouth curved into a disgusting smile, as he nodded his head in approval of Cronarius' submission, before shifting his focus back to Celestia, who was watching the exchange between the two men with a disturbed expression on her otherwise flawless face. Though the trade prince did not comment on this, and instead spoke with an excited look in his beady eyes. Now, where to begin? Chapter 28. The Gindari Trade Prince Bixel Golden Tooth had a toothy grin on his face as he mediated the discussion between the admirals of the Alfheim Dominion and the Svartalfheim Federation. Though neither side had overtly attacked yet, the two factions were currently engaging with one another in open conflict via their proxies at the borders. Since the Alfheim Dominion was not able to call upon the Germanic Star Empire to ravage the enemy's fleets, due to the threat which they were currently facing from the Naraka Hive fleet terminus. Nor could she call upon the Rylonian Imperium, who were destroyed by Terminus. Lunaria had been using several of her other vessels to wage war against her rivals' proxies. However, these vassals were not societies born and bred for the purpose of war, unlike the Germanic Star Empire, and thus, they were far more evenly matched with their opponents. While the border wars continued to wage on, the Gindari Trade Prince Bixel Golden Tooth had been chosen to mediate the dispute. Who began to speak of the terms he felt were most agreeable between the two factions. I think we all know what must be done here, so long as the two of you swear on behalf of your respective civilizations not to start a war. Then I believe the contested regions, which you are both fighting for control over, can be settled via your proxies, who are already engaging in combat with each other as we speak. Though I must say, I fear the Alfheim Dominion is at a disadvantage since the tragedy with the Rylonian Imperium has occurred. Perhaps if you could order those violent curs of yours to enter the fray, then you might be able to even the odds, but I hear they are currently entrenched in a war with a minor power. And it will be several months before they are able to enter this conflict. The Dark Elf Admiral smirked with satisfaction as he heard that the Germanic Star Empire would not be able to interfere in this dispute. After all, their proxies had lost the last 100 wars with those vicious beasts, and it would appear that the Gindari Trade Prince had the same opinion as the Dark Elves when it came to the Germanic people. Thus, he took advantage of the situation to gain some favor from Bixel, who had vast control over the galaxy's economy. I might be able to broker an end to these hostilities altogether. After all, if certain conditions are met by the Gindari Trade Union, then I am sure the President will be more than happy to give up on reclaiming our lost territory. I have an offer that Mr. Golden Tooth might find appealing. If the Alfheim Dominion agrees to force those savages, you refer to as Germans to accept the Gindari banking clans into their empire, and the Gindari Trade Union agrees to pay us a broker's fee for arranging this agreement, then I see no reason to continue squabbling over a few border systems for the next 100 years. While this deal might seem to be beneficial to the Alfheim Dominion on the surface, the reality was that if Celestia accepted this offer, it would have long-reaching consequences. She knew that neither the Germanic Star Empire nor her mother would ever accept this offer. After all, her mother had a policy of not interfering with her vassal sovereignty unless they did not meet their dues. If Lunaria forced the Germanic Star Empire to accept the Gindari banking clans into their empire, then she would not only be losing the loyalty of her most favored warhound, but she would also be inviting rebellion from 100 other interstellar civilizations, all of which maintain their sovereignty when it came to internal matters. Such a deal would tear the Western Quadrant apart, and the Dark Elf Admiral knew this, hence why he had posed such a tantalizing deal to the avaricious trade prince. Yet, despite the consequences this would have on galactic stability, the trade prince did not even seem to care in the slightest. He was practically salivating at the idea of forcing his way into the Germanic Star Empire, whose self-sufficient economy was a threat to the trade union's wealth and power. If the rest of the interstellar states across the Milky Way began to pursue a position of economic autarky, the Gindari Trade Union would lose everything. This is why they had spent so much effort trying to force their way into the Germanic markets, and had wasted a considerable sum turning the rest of the galaxy against the Germanic race with galactic-wide propaganda. Yet despite all their efforts, even going so far as to influence other civilizations to wage war against the Empire, the Germanic race stood untied and defiant against the Gimdari trade union, growing ever stronger as the years went by. Thus Bixel immediately rubbed his hands in an avaricious gesture as he sided with his Svartalfheim dominion, and in doing so violated his position as a mediator. I must say, this is indeed an excellent proposal. I see no other alternative which can avoid an all-out war and ensure peace across the galaxy. Would you not agree, Your Highness? Celestia was practically scowling at the two-faced hook-nosed Wat from the Gimdari trade union. Of course, he would immediately disregard his role as mediator when the first bribe came his way. As a result, Celestia immediately put her foot down in these negotiations and called out Bixel for his bullshit. It's funny, my mother once told me of a quote, which originates from the first supreme leader of the Germanic Star Empire when he first encountered your race. It believed it was something along the lines of, the Gimdari is immunized against all dangers, one may call him a scoundrel, parasite, swindler, profiteer. It all runs off him like water off a raincoat. But call him a Gimdari and you will be astonished at how he recoils, how injured he is, how he suddenly shrinks back. I have been found out. The origin of this quote was a direct copy of Joseph Goebbels' remarks regarding the Jewish people of Earth, to which the first supreme leader of the Germanic Star Empire simply substituted the word Jew with Gimdari. If one thought about every negative stereotype associated with the Jewish people, whether or not they were true, and applied it to the Gimdari race, then it would indeed be a realistic depiction of the alien species. Naturally, Bixel had heard this quote before, and was quite perturbed that the Alfheim princess would dare to utter it aloud in front of him. His beady eyes narrowed as his sharp teeth twisted into a hideous snarl. He knew exactly what the relatively young woman was accusing him of, and was insulted not because it was a false allegation, but because it was completely true. The Dark Elf Admiral was horrified that the young Light Elf princess had the guts to call Bixel out on his schemes. He was beginning to think that the girl was either incredibly brave or an absolute moron. After all, the Gimdari trade union had enough power to collapse the economy of the Alfheim Dominion. By insulting one of their trade princes, with a particularly disparaging remark about their entire species, it was inviting an economic disaster. Yet, Celestia did not appear the slightest bit concerned about such a thing, and simply stared down the tiny and fat goblin before speaking aloud in an authoritative tone. The Alfheim Dominion has the military power to destroy your so-called home world, and don't you forget it. Now, I suggest you rethink your priorities, because from what I see, you, our supposed mediator, is seriously considering a bribe, and if that gets out to the rest of the galaxy, I wonder how many civilizations will continue to employ your species as mediators in their conflicts. Despite having every urge to employ economic sanctions against the Alfheim Dominion, Bixel did not dare do so. They had spent a considerable amount of time and effort manipulating the galaxy's perspective of their species, and if word of this little incident were to get out, then it would be disastrous for the entirety of the Gimdari trade union. Thus, with a deep breath to calm his nerves, Bixel forced a toothy smile, as he nodded his head in agreement with Celestia's assessment, before going back to the initial plan of de-escalation. Very well, you have made your point. I believe I have no choice but to decline your offer, Admiral. Instead, I will stick to my initial proposal of continuing this conflict via proxies. Are there any objections to this from either side? Celestia silently shook her head, showing that she had no objections. While the Dark Elf Admiral was visibly scowling over the fact that his bribe had been denied, and was forced to revert this conflict back to a proxy war. While gritting his teeth, he agreed to the original deal, and begrudgingly so. Fine. I have no qualms about this resolution. Whoever wins this proxy war gets control of the contested star systems. After saying this, the Dark Elf Admiral hung up, leaving the Gimdari Trade Prince and Light Elf Princess alone, to which Bixel chuckled sinisterly as he made a foreboding remark. You better watch your back, Princess. The remarks that you just made have made you an enemy of the Gimdari, and you know as well as I what happens to those who oppose us. After saying this, Bixel hung up as well, leaving Celestia by herself as she sighed heavily. Realizing that although she had avoided plunging the Western Quadrant into chaos, she had just painted a target on her back by a race that was known for covertly assassinating those who posed a threat to their narrative. With this in mind, the Crown Princess of the Alfheim Dominion suddenly found herself having more respect for the Germanic Star Empire, who so boldly told the truth about the Gimdari, despite the danger it presented to their entire civilization. Chapter 29, Overdose. The Germanic Star Empire was entirely unaware of how close they were to being forced by their suzerains to allow the banking clans of the Gimdari trade union into their territory. If this were to have happened, it would have shattered the bonds between the Alfheim Dominion and their favorite hounds. It would have only be a matter of time before the Germanic nation rose up in arms against their masters. Nor were they aware of the risk that the Alphaean Dominion's crown princess had taken to ensure their sovereignty over internal matters. But just because the Germans did not know of these things, it did not mean that the Alphaean Empress was so ignorant. In fact, just after the conference call ended between Celestia, Bixel, and Granarius, the young admiral contacted her esteemed mother to report on the situation at hand. When Lunaria heard that her daughter had been threatened by one of those slimly little scoundrels, she had every intention of sending her fleets to decimate the Gimdari homeworld. However, in the end, she decided to increase the security around her youngest daughter, and send a stern warning to all the Gimdari trade princes that if Celestia were to wind up dead, or missing, she would hold their people responsible and wipe them from the face of the galaxy. As for Eric, even if he was aware of the dispute between the Asterian dynasty and the Golden Tooth Cartel, which had emerged as a result of the border wars, he could not have cared any less. Instead, he was busy flying over yet another Dvrakian world, fighting what was left of the enemy's starfighter corps. While the capital ships of the Dvrakian navy had been decimated over the skies of Thrikles, the consortium still maintained the ability to manufacture warships. But, rather than waste their precious resources on larger ships like destroyers and battleships, they adopted a policy of mass-producing fighters and bombers to protect what few worlds they still held on to. At first, these new waves of small spacecraft were piloted by Dvrakians, but as the numbers of their available pilots rapidly dwindled, the Dvrakian consortium was forced to operate what remained of their fleet with robotic pilots powered by primitive artificial intelligences. These robots were not as capable as actual trained pilots, and thus they were even more easily shot out of the sky, but they were easy to manufacture, and could be mass-produced in quantities that far outpaced the consortium's ability to train new pilots. Thus, while robots fought in the orbit of the remaining Dvrakian worlds, the rest of their military focused primarily on defending the planets from the Germanic ground forces. At the moment, Eric was sitting in his cockpit. By now, all the paint had been scratched off his interceptor. The machine was only operable due to the cannibalization of other starfighters which were damaged beyond repair during the war. The war had been waging on for nearly 8 months at this point, and most of the Dvrakian consortium had fallen. As the vanguard of the invasion, the First Armada was left without resupply for months on end, forcing the crews on board the vessels to become quite creative in how they maintained their ships. In the entirety of the Germanic Star Empire's military history, they had never once advanced their troops beyond the reach of their supply lines, having learned from the mistakes of their ancestors on Earth centuries prior. However, with the Naraka Hive fleet so near to their borders, and getting ever closer with each passing day, the Admiralty was convinced that sacrifices needed to be made to ensure that their plans to use the Dvrakians as a buffer were actually accomplished in time, thus deciding to push past them this once, for victory was in sight. Of course, the rank and file of the Empire's forces did not know about this great threat which was lurking beyond their borders, and thus, the veterans of the Dvrakian War had become quite disgruntled due to the way they were treated in the conflict. Eric could not remember the last time he had gotten more than 2 hours of sleep. By now, even the Dvrakian fire whiskey had lost its refreshing effect, and he was becoming quite drowsy as he piloted his interceptor through the orbit of what appeared to be an oceanic world. Realizing that his eyelids were closing on their own, Eric reached towards his left thigh with his offhand, and grabbed hold of what resembled an EpiPen from 21st century Earth. However, the container was entirely transparent, revealing the neon green liquid that was contained within it. Normally Eric would carry 4 of these things on the left thigh of his flight suit to get him through his 22-hour shift, but after only 12 hours of combat, he had already been through 3 of them. His vision began to fade as he mumbled something that was barely coherent. Fug. Last on. After saying this, Eric pressed the top button of the device, which revealed a hypodermic needle, which he then jammed through his left thigh, into the femoral artery, which rapidly carried the stimulant through the rest of his body, forcing his eyes open to their maximum width. Eric felt as if his brain had cleared right up in a single second, and shortly thereafter an eager smile had replaced the drooling gape that was his mouth. He felt as if he were a living god, that no harm could possibly come to him, and as a result he eagerly hit the throttle of his interceptor to the maximum speed, sending him zooming through orbit and towards his allies who were requesting backup. Either he did not see it, or he did not care, but the hole that was punctured into his pressurized flight suit immediately sealed itself, preventing any and all oxygen from escaping. The interceptor shot through space at a rapid speed, before Eric began to pull back his throttle as he quickly approached his target. No more than 5,000 kilometers out, there was another interceptor that looked almost exactly like his own, which was taking fire from 3 hostiles. As a result, Eric flipped the switch on his joystick, activating his missiles as he locked onto all 3 targets at once. Normally, a pilot would only be able to lock onto one target at a time, but, because of Eric's cyberkinesis, he was able to push the targeting array beyond its limits, and thus, when he pressed the button, 3 missiles were launched at the target which, despite the enemy's best attempts to launch their countermeasures, the missiles continued towards their targets until detonating on their hulls. Eric screamed through his comms in excitement as he saved his allies' ass, while also eliminating 3 hostiles in one go. "Woo! Take that, you worthless hunks of scrap metal!" An annoyed voice called out to Eric from the other end of the line, which he recognized as his wing commander. "Damn it, Silver, those were mine." Eric simply chuckled before responding to the wing commander's complaint with a voice that was unnaturally speedy. "Sorry, Commander, but you snooze you lose. Besides, I just saved your ass. You owe me." Judging by how quickly Eric spat out those words, it did not take the wing commander long to realize that Eric had just popped another one of his stims, and thus decided not to argue with the man while he was as high as one could be. Instead, his voice shifted to one of concern as he asked the question which he was not sure that he wanted an answer to. "Silver, how many of those stims do you have left?" Eric did not even need to think about the number of stims he had taken before responding to the commander with a carefree voice. "That was my last one. I suppose I should go back and get more, huh?" Contrary to what Eric was expecting, the voice of the commander immediately turned to one filled with anger as he yelled at Eric over the comms with all the fury he could muster. "You fucking idiot. You took all 4 of your stims in 12 hours. Get your ass back to the carrier and check in with medical before you overdose. If we end up losing another interceptor because of an overdose, the Admiral will have my ass." Eric did not even think about the possibility of an overdose when he had taken all 4 of his stims because his brain had been too exhausted to even calculate the risk. However, now that his mind was fully clear, he realized how badly he had fucked up. Thus, his heart immediately began to palpitate as an overwhelming sense of anxiety filled his mind. He only managed to get out one word before darting back towards the carrier at top speed. "Roger." With this, Eric flew back to the carrier as fast as he could. However, as he was approaching the hangar, he found that his mouth had begun to foam and his muscles had begun to seize. If he did not manage to slow down soon, he would crash right into the hangar and not only blow himself up, but also take quite a few other pilots, and their starfighters, with him. Unfortunately, he could not manage to control the joystick, nor could he speak properly into his comms to request an immediate landing, thus all he could do was muster all the strength left in his body and force a crash landing onto the deck. As Eric had approached the landing bay without proper authorization, the point defenses of the capital ship began to fire at him, which battered his shields until there was nothing left. However, he just barely managed to slip past the ship's defenses before his starfighter could be blown apart, and in doing so crashed into the landing bay. The interceptor skid through the deck, grinding itself apart as it slowly made its way to the other end. Just before the fighter was about to crunch into a pancake against a massive wall, it came to a full stop, where the carrier's quick reaction force rapidly approached the heavily damaged starfighter with their plasma rifles in hand. Once they managed to force open the shattered cockpit, they found an unconscious pilot who needed immediate medical attention. As for the damage that Eric had caused to the actual carrier, it was minimal, and could easily be repaired once they finally managed to dock back in Imperial space. Eric awoke on a bed sometime later while dressed in nothing but a patient's gown. He did not know how he had gotten into this strange chamber, which he knew to be what was referred to by the Empire as a med bay, but he could guess one of 2 things had occurred. Either he died, and was now cloned on some facility within the Empire's borders. Or he had been successfully transported to the medical facility on board the carrier, and stuffed into a med bay while unconscious, which automatically repaired all the damage that his body had received. One thing was certain, all the fatigue, pain, and stress he had endured over these past 8 months had suddenly vanished. It was because of this that he truly believed he had died and been cloned. However, this was not the case, as the medbay quickly opened itself, to reveal that he was indeed sitting in a medical clinic on board the carrier. Standing over Eric was the ship's doctor, who shook his head and sighed before informing his patient of just what had happened. "Honestly, kid, you're lucky to be alive. It probably would have been more efficient to just euthanize you, and have you cloned. But, the Admiral insisted that all pilots who could be saved must be saved. After all, we're already short-staffed as is. Do you have any idea what kind of damage you have done to your body? 4 stimulants in merely 12 hours. What? Were you trying to get yourself killed? Well? Come on. Don't just gawk at me like an idiot, answer me." Eric had never before in his life been injured enough to use a medbay, and he was still getting over the idea that no matter how mangled his body was, no matter how much damage had been dealt to his internal organs by the overdose, he had emerged perfectly fine. In fact, he was better than before. After taking a few moments to formulate a proper response, he finally spoke to the doctor. "I didn't mean to. I was just so tired that I couldn't perform my duties. I didn't even think about a possible overdose, and instinctively jammed that needle into my thigh. How much damage to the ship did I cause?" To this, the doctor scoffed, before informing Eric that he hadn't caused much damage at all. You really think that puny fighter of yours is capable of damaging one of these carriers in any significant capacity? The only damage you dealt was to yourself and your interceptor. Fixing you was an easy task, but fixing that damn ship of yours, with the limited supplies we currently have? That is going to be a challenge. Luckily, I became a doctor and not a mechanic. Because I have no idea how they are going to repair that scrap heap. Now, judging by the fact that you are capable of carrying a conversation, I would say you are no longer my problem. Report to your wing commander so he can give you a proper scolding. After saying this, the doctor tossed Eric a new flight suit before walking out of the room. He had other patients that he needed to tend to, and now that Eric was out of the med bay, it could be used by someone else. Eric, however, felt a particular sense of dread in his chest, as he just knew it was a matter of certainty that he was going to get chewed out for what he had just done. Chapter 30, Rest and Respite. Eric could not remember the last time he had been scolded so severely. After the battle was won, he was forced to meet up with his wing commander, who did not hesitate to rip him a new one over the damage he had caused. Without a doubt, the interceptor which Eric had flown up until this point was completely mangled beyond repair. As a result, he would be tasked with flying a bomber for the rest of the war. Or until a resupply could happen. However, that was unlikely to occur, at least not for the First Armada, who in order to push the pace of the conflict, had advanced so far beyond supply lines that they would literally need to flee from their current position by several dozen light years before being able to replace that which they had lost. Despite the urgent need for pilots in the First Armada, the doctor on board the carrier had decided to put his foot down, and somehow managed to convince the admiral to allow the men who operated the starfighters to get some proper rest. After all, Eric was not the first pilot among the ranks of the Imperial Navy who had been pushed to the point of overdosing on stimulants. Thus, for the time being, Eric was grounded, and was required to get at least 2 weeks of rest before he was allowed anywhere near a cockpit. This was perhaps the slowest time had moved since the man had first entered military service, as a life revolving around non-stop action seemed to have permitted time to pass by quite rapidly. Now that he was stuck on the carrier for 24 hours a day, Eric did not know how to spend his time, and had even begun to feel a sort of mental withdrawal towards the lack of action. Luckily, he had access to the grid, and thus, for the first time in 8 months, he was able to see what was going on within the borders of the Empire. The first thing that popped up on his display screen was the advertisement for Erica Krieger's new drama, which she would be starring in. Looking upon the face of the woman who had caused him so much grief filled Eric with disgust as he scoffed before voicing his disbelief aloud. For fuck's sake, she's acting now? Just kill me now. The pop-up immediately shifted to a movie trailer, which, try as he might, Eric found himself unable to skip out of. Whether or not the girl actually had any talent as an actress, Eric did not know the answer, but one thing was certain, the Germanic entertainment industry was heavily pushing her on all of its citizens. Finally, after enduring through nearly 3 minutes worth of content he would rather not see, Eric was finally able to move on to the news, where he found that the war had taken up much of the broadcast. Luckily, the previous controversies he had been instrumental in creating had died down, as the Empire seemed to forget that the silver-haired mutant had even existed, and instead focused on cheering for their servicemen who fought against a horde of demons. Interestingly enough, one of the videos which was being displayed on the news was from the Battle of the Bloody Gulch, which had occurred months ago. At first Eric thought he might be seeing things, but there was no mistake. The antimatter bomb which exploded on camera was the one he had dropped on the Drakian shield generators. The craziest thing of all was that this footage is being displayed with the banner live from the front lines, which only caused Eric to believe that the Empire was purposely throttling the coverage of the war, perhaps because of how much of a meat grinder it had become. The Drakian military, while technologically inferior to the Germanic armed forces, had one thing on their side that the Empire did not. And that was the time. Because the Germanic Star Empire was forced to advance so far beyond their supply lines, they had become severely limited in the number of troops and resources they could commit to the war. In fact, the other 9 armadas, which the Empire had deployed to the region, were busy in cleaning up the mess that the First Armada had left behind, while establishing a foothold over the war-torn worlds. And while the other 9 armadas were practically fresh in terms of rest, resources, and manpower, the First Armada continued to plow forward through a storm of electromagnetic projectiles, as they attempted to end the war as quickly as possible. Now that Eric thought about it, he did not understand why the Admiralty had forced the First Armada into such a desperate position, when any of the other 9 armadas could be used to relieve them. Had the Admiral in charge of the First Armada done something to anger his superiors? Ultimately, the reason that the First Armada had become the spearhead of the Germanic invasion was actually a policy of maintaining reserves. As the war with the Drakians continued to wage on, the Empire was vastly expanding its armed forces at the home front. 100 fleets had become 150 in a little over half a year. And despite the fact that these 50 fleets could be used to end the war quicker, it also meant that the Empire would be giving up many of the resources it had just managed to create. Meanwhile, the First Armada might be pushed to the breaking point, but so far they had managed to claim over 80% of the Dovrakian consortium without reinforcements or resupply. Thus, until they were operating as a skeleton crew, the Admiralty would continue to press forward the unit, which had already suffered the most losses, rather than incur more losses from other armadas. Of course, the more losses the First Armada suffered, the fewer men they had to support their campaign, and thus they would suffer even more casualties at a higher rate. But this was a risk the Admiralty was willing to take. Naturally, Eric did not know any of this. He was just a simple lieutenant, and thus he was not privy to the machinations of high command. Thus, he could only continue to watch the news and witness the battlefield on the ground from the perspective of the Star Marine's helmet cams. Sitting in a rectangular room within the naval headquarters on the world of Germania was the Grand Admiral of the Imperial Navy, and several members of the Admiralty, who had all gathered together in person to discuss the serious matters which they were facing. Admiral Alarico Emre sat in silence with a stoic expression on his face as he listened to his subordinates speak about the ongoing improvements they had been making to the fleet. Thanks to the generosity of the Alphaean Dominion, we have been able to improve our energy shields by roughly 50%. These modifications are currently being made to the 50 fleets that are waiting within the borders of the Empire, and will be retrofitted onto the 100 which are currently deployed abroad after the war with the Dovrakian consortium has been won. It might not seem like much, but it does give us a slightly better chance at surviving the upcoming Naraku invasion. Alaric sighed heavily when he heard this, before responding in a way that immediately crumbled the confidence which had been built among his subordinates after hearing this statement. A measly 50% increase in power to our energy shields is not going to stop a Naraku hive fleet from tearing us apart. We need to invest in weapons like the AM-59 World Killer Torpedo. Weapons that are capable of one-shotting the ships of our enemies. And unless we can develop more of such weapons, we have a very small chance of survival. Now, enough about the Naraku. We will deal with them when the time comes. I want to know about the ongoing crisis which our soldiers are facing at the front lines in the war with the Dovrakian consortium. Is it true that we have lost 75% of our starfighter pilots amongst the First Armada? A quarter of which were from overdosing on stimulants? At this rate, the First Armada will have a difficult time defending the dropships, let alone the capital ships. The Admiralty paled after hearing the figures that the Grand Admiral had just spoken. It was indeed true that the First Armada had suffered heavy losses over the past 8 months. With 75% of the pilots having either been killed in combat, or dying of drug overdoses. Those who died were cloned back in the Empire with all their memories intact, but there was simply no way to transport them from the borders of the Empire back to the front lines of war, and even if they could, what ships would they fly? Knowing this, nobody dared to speak up, which only confirmed the figure to be true with a fierce gaze in his eyes, Alaric gave the order, which the rest of the admirals had been waiting to receive for months now. Withdraw the First Armada back to the Empire. I want it repaired, resupplied, and filled with reinforcements. As for those 25% of pilots who are still on the front lines, even as we speak, give them 4 months of leave, they have more than earned it. We will replace the First Armada with the Second and Third Armadas, who will continue the assault on the remaining 20% of worlds that the Dovrakian consortium still has a holdover. I do not want something this embarrassing to happen ever again. Am I understood? The other admirals obediently nodded their heads like children being scolded by their parents. With this said, the First Armada would finally be given some reprieve after 8 months of non-stop combat. Chapter 31, Buying a new starship. For the first time in 8 months, the First Armada of the Imperial Navy had gotten some much-needed reprieve from their daily lives of combat. What remained of the Armada was quickly relived by 2 others who, once on the front lines, allowed Derek and his unit to return to Imperial space where they were to undergo repair, rearmament, and resupply. After arriving back in Imperial space, Eric felt as if an enormous weight had been lifted off his chest. He had served well over 5,000 hours in combat, and by now, he felt as if his blood had been permanently ignited by the adrenaline which seemed to never leave his system. If there was one thing that was capable of bringing his nerves back into proper order, it would be alcohol. In fact, he felt a burning desire to have a drink. No, not just 1 drink, but a dozen, maybe 2. However, such quantity of alcohol was illegal for consumption, and the only way to get his hands on it would be through the black market, which had been driven deep underground due to the intense nature of Germanic law enforcement agencies. If Eric wanted to truly relax in what limited time he had, then he would have to visit one of these black market space stations, which existed hidden away from the public eye, primarily in asteroid fields. Of course, Eric did not even possess his own starship, and thus he had no way of actually traveling to one of these locations. However, after 8 months of active service as lieutenant in the Navy, as well as the credits he had accrued via winning the virtual reality starfighter tournament, which now seemed like a lifetime ago, Eric could easily afford his own starship. However, despite the Empire having a vast military-industrial complex, which even offered civilian equipment, he hadn't the slightest idea what ship to purchase. At the moment, Eric was sitting on an industrial world, whose primary purpose was manufacturing and repair. In the orbit of this world was a large tech ring, which acted as a massive shipyard. This was where the First Armada was currently undergoing repair. As for the crew who served upon its vessels, they were given free rein to return to their families for the remainder of their leave. But Eric did not have a family, at least not any longer, thus he spent a considerable amount of time wandering the planet's primary city. The world of Quadi had a primarily savanna climate, which was mostly destroyed by the many factories which littered its surface. Yet, the heat that accompanied such an environment did not dissipate. In fact, it had only been intensified by the heavy industry which was active at all hours of the day. Thus, Eric found himself sweating quite profusely as he made his way to the local starport, where he would be able to purchase a starship for himself. After stepping foot in the facility, Eric's face was blasted by a cool atmosphere which was generated by the building's life support system, and as a result was able to take a deep breath and sigh in relief now that he was out of the blazing light of the star. After approaching a kiosk which had access to the inventory of ships which were available to purchase throughout the entire star system, Eric was approached by a young woman who was dressed in an employee uniform. She took one look at the solid black jumpsuit, which Eric wore, and exclaimed in shock, before introducing herself. "Oh, my. Are you perhaps a member of the legendary Black Sun Squadron? My name is Anna Paulson, and I would be happy to assist you in finding the perfect starship for your personal use." Eric looked around, believing that perhaps the woman was speaking to someone else. Maybe another member of his unit. After all, he had never seen a store clerk treat him with anything but suspicion before, due to his so-called genetic defects. When he realized that the woman was speaking to him, he pointed at himself and asked for clarification on the matter, just to be sure he was not imagining things. "Me? Are you talking to me?" The woman looked at him with confusion in her deep blue eyes, before wearing a pretty smile and nodding her head. "Of course, you are the only one here wearing the uniform of the Black Sunday. You are a pilot in that legendary squadron, are you not?" Eric smiled as he shook his head in disbelief. Never before in his life would he believe that a random stranger would treat him with the same politeness they did everyone else, and thus he was quick to voice this shock, even if he did not mean to do so. "I can't believe it." The woman tilted her head with a confused expression on her face before asking for clarification about just what Eric was talking about. "You can't believe what, sir?" Looking around at the shop, and all the astonished gazes that people were giving him, only added to the confusion that Eric currently felt. Thus, he shook his head once more and sighed, before finally answering the woman's question. "It's nothing. Yes, I am a member of the Black Sun, Lieutenant Eric Yeager. It is a pleasure to meet you, miss, and I would be honored if you could assist me in finding a good starship for my personal use, especially since I am not entirely sure what I am looking for. I could use a professional's opinion." The woman smiled once more and giggled slightly as she made a remark about Eric's status in comparison to her own. "You're going to make me blush. If you're not a qualified professional, then what could I possibly be? But I would be happy to assist you. Is there anything in particular you are looking for?" Eric thought deeply on this question for several moments. There were many requirements were a must in a personal starship, and he did not know if there was actually a model that meets his needs. But simply gave caution to the wind and voiced what he desired most outright. "I would prefer that my starship have the ability to traverse across the Empire with relative ease, and perhaps even beyond Imperial space, if I ever get the clearance to do so. Thus, a large fuel supply is mandatory. It should also be capable of being operated by one man if needed, but no more than 5 men in total. I will need proper living quarters for each crew member, along with a mess hall and a functional restroom. I would prefer if the ship had a decent-sized cargo bay, but not so much that it diminishes its combat capabilities. The vessel would need at least size 3 gimbal-mounted weapons, with missiles of a similar size. As for the shield generators, it would be ideal if they were large." While Eric was speaking to the woman about his requirements, he saw that her eyes lit up with a data stream, signaling that she had connected herself to the grid, most likely in search of a ship which met most, if not all, of his requirements. After several moments of searching, a wide smile lit up her face, before she placed her hands together and jumped a little in excitement. "You will be happy to know that I have several starships that meet your requirements. All of these models are marketed as expeditionary craft, but if you are really looking for more offensive capabilities, then I suggest the Hydra interplanetary privateer. I would just be careful when dealing with the authorities while piloting such a vessel, because Hydra's line of ships have a reputation for being used most commonly by pirates. And though piracy has all but been eliminated within our borders, many of our more, shall I say, unruly citizens have begun operating beyond imperial space, committing a number of heinous crimes with ships like the privateer. After saying this, the sales representative transferred the information on the privateer, as well as the other offerings, to Eric via the grid, to which he began to closely scrutinize each and every vessel. In the end he could only sigh, and nod his head in agreement with the woman's opinion. The privateer was exactly what he needed in a starship. There was just one problem: he could not afford the 3 million credit price tag. With a heavy sigh, Eric bowed his head before admitting defeat. "I'm sorry, that is just out of my price range." The woman looked slightly taken aback. She knew how much money officers made in the military, and if this man was a special forces pilot, then his yearly salary was no less than 150,000 credits. Assuming he was soon retiring, and had been in service for 20 years, then he should definitely have the money for the ship. It suddenly dawned on her that this man might actually be the age he appeared to be, and with an astonished look on her face she asked Eric a question which he was not anticipating. "Excuse me, sir, if you don't mind answering my question, just how old are you?" Eric chuckled as he heard this, before informing the woman of his age, which only further increased the shock she felt. "I have just turned 21 this year." "Why do you ask?" In the Germanic Star Empire, people aged very slowly, largely due to their genetic enhancements. There were men and women well over 100 years old who looked as if they were in their 20s. Anna herself was actually 75 this year. She never would have guessed that this man, who should by all means should still be at the military academy, was actually so young, and a lieutenant no less. However, in the next moment, her lips curved into a sly smile as she whispered something in Eric's ears that he never thought he would hear from a woman as respectable as this sales representative. "You know, if you are short on credits, I know a way that you can quickly make some fat cash." Eric had a bad feeling about what the woman had just said. The only way to make 3 million credits before he was forced to redeploy was through criminal means, and he did not want to end up on the wrong end of the law if he could avoid it at all. However, Anna continued to whisper sweet poison into Eric's ear, and he continued to listen. "Naturally, as someone who sells a lot of Hydra's products, I have come into contact with some unsavory individuals. It just so happens that I know of a crew which is looking for an experienced pilot to help them with a little task. I won't lie to you. It is incredibly dangerous, and will certainly result in a harsh sentence if anyone were to find out, but you could easily make 3 million or more from a day's worth of work. Are you perhaps interested?" Despite every single instinct in Eric's body telling him to decline the offer, he did not dare do so. For him, who had always skirted the line of what was considered legal, and a serious offense, it was too tempting to make that kind of money in such a short amount of time. While he could wait, and save his money for 2 decades before buying such a ship, Eric was not exactly the most patient man in the world, and he had no idea how he was going to spend the next 3 months of leave, if it were not drowning himself in alcohol. The level of stress he had endured these past few months was enough to give any man a serious mental condition, with adrenaline and endorphins flooding through his veins as if a dam had broken. His mind never stopped thinking about the things he had seen and done during his brief tenure as a combat pilot. If he was going to get the rest he needed to continue his job, then he would need to get his hands on some illicit substances, and if he was going to do that, then he would need a starship of his own. Thus, he bit the proverbial bullet and nodded his head in silence after several moments of contemplation. Seeing that Eric had accepted her offer, Anna transferred some coordinates to him via the grid, before giving him some proper advice. "These men aren't looking for anything more than a skilled pilot, so do your job, and you will get paid your share. However, I would recommend that you wear a flight suit and helmet that is less conspicuous. Luckily, I can sell you just what you need. After you get changed, meet my contact at those coordinates, and he will tell you everything you need to know about the job. Good luck, and I hope to see you soon." It took Eric several moments to realize that he had just sent himself on a path that could very well lead to a lifetime of service in a penal battalion. And if there were ever a time to turn back, it would be now. Still, he did not do so. Instead he did as Anna suggested and purchased a less flashy flight suit and helmet, one with a visor that was tinted so that his facial features were not revealed. He then took a shuttle to another point in the city, where a small bar was tucked away between several larger buildings. Here, he would begin his first foray into the criminal underworld. Chapter 32, Entering the criminal underworld. Eric stepped foot into the bar and quickly found himself practically all alone. There were only 2 men other than himself inside the run-down establishment. One was the bartender, and the other was a sinister-looking man, who was quite burly and riddled in what were clearly battle scars. After sitting down at the table, the burly man took a quick glance at Eric before posing a simple question to him. "Are you the new guy? The one that Anna recommended?" Eric silently nodded his head in affirmation of the man's question, to which the burly man then raised 2 fingers, thus ordering 2 shots of whiskey for himself and his new partner before introducing himself. "The name is Drake. I heard from the girl that you are quite the experienced pilot. Is that true?" Eric once more silently nodded his head, confirming that he was indeed an experienced pilot. Shortly thereafter the bartender handed them their drinks, to which Eric and Drake took their shots in an act of solidarity. Afterwards, the bartender pressed a button beneath the counter which locked the doors and windows of the bar, while also changing the sign outside from open to closed. Once this was finished, Drake began to speak of the job while the bartender fetched them a few more drinks. "Alright, here are the details of the job. There is a facility on an abandoned moon, just outside the Empire's borders. It sits between the Empire and the Ana's borders. This facility, well, you could say that it produces a certain product. Don't ask me what it is. You don't need to know that information. Just know that it is in high demand, and will sell for a premium within the Empire's borders. Your job is to get us to the site, and to get us out of there, alive and with the cargo intact. You do that, and you will get an even share of the profits. You ever fly a heavy freighter before?" Though Eric had not actually flown a freighter before, he was experienced enough with much faster craft, so much so that he was confident he could fulfill the task at hand, and thus he nodded his head in silence once more. Which put a smile on Drake's face, who took another shot, and after wiping his mouth of the alcoholic beverage, he clapped Eric on the back. "Alright, from here on out, I'm going to refer to you as Apex. I don't need to know your real name, just like you don't need to know mine. Do the job, and get paid, that's all there is to it. Just one last thing. We are expecting fierce competition, so I hope you know how to dogfight." Eric took another shot and nodded his head once more, which put an even wider smile on Drake's face. Afterwards, the 2 men stood up, where Drake exited the facility with Eric in tow. The dynamic duo then took a train to the starport, where they regrouped with the rest of the crew. If there was such a thing as overtly being a criminal, then these men met the standard. Much to Eric's surprise, many of these men were mutants like himself, thus they did not bat an eye at his unique appearance, and instead welcomed him into their band of misfits. Eric took one look at the freighter, and could tell he would be able to fly it quite easily. It was not a giant spaceship by any means, at least not as large as many of the other heavy freighters he had seen. But it did have a long neck, with multiple compartments to store cargo or, in this case, contraband. After entering the pilot seat and powering on the vehicle, Eric was able to effectively pilot the ship out of the starport and into orbit, where he activated the quantum drives before heading towards the coordinates that Drake had given him. The journey to the destination took quite some time. It was not a mere day's worth of work like Anna had claimed. In fact, just to reach the edge of the Empire's borders it had taken them several stops for refueling, along with nearly 2 weeks of travel. During this time, Eric got to know only the briefest information about the crew, such as the pseudonyms they went by. Most of the time was spent playing cards in the mess hall of the ship. It was only after 2 weeks had passed that the ship came out of quantum and, in doing so, revealed a large blue gas giant, and a small moon just beside it. It was exactly as Drake had claimed. However, the sensors clearly indicated they were not alone, and thus Eric sent a command to the rest of the crew to prepare for combat. "Heads up, we are not alone out here. I'd recommend getting into the turrets, because we are about to make contact with some hostiles." The crew quickly got themselves in order, as they entered the multiple turrets on board the ship, while preparing for combat. Eric boldly drove the ship towards the other vessels, where he immediately locked on to the smallest of the 3 ships, which appeared to be a light freighter. Without even bothering to say hello, he began to open fire as he darted around the 3 ships with some difficulty. After all, this was not a light fighter, nor was it an interceptor, or even a bomber. This was a freighter, and it moved just like one would expect it to. Still, Eric managed to maintain a sight picture on the hostile vessels, and when combined with the multiple turrets on board the ship, he was able to lay down some serious firepower, even if the hostiles were more maneuverable than he was. After firing his weapons for nearly a minute, the light freighter, which Eric had targeted, ignited, expelling its cargo into space. As for Eric, he quickly transitioned his targeting array to a second target, which was a larger ship. Knowing that he would not be able to take it out as easily with just the laser repeaters, he switched to missiles, where he quickly fired 3 of them off in succession. Due to the nature of his current actions, Eric was naturally aware that now was not the best time to reveal his special abilities, some of which were exceptionally rare, and thus, he did not use his cyberkinesis to bypass the enemy's countermeasures. Instead, he switched back to his laser repeaters and continued to fire at the enemy to the best of his abilities. His shields had taken some damage, but it was nothing he couldn't handle, and thus, after another brief dogfight, the second hostile ship exploded. With only 1 ship remaining, Eric had just managed to shift his sights onto it, before the cowards jumped into space, leaving behind their fallen comrades and their expelled cargo. Much to his surprise, Drake shouted over the comms in a voice that was filled with excitement. "Goddamn Apex, that was some mighty fine flying. Hold us here, and we will use the tractor beams to collect the enemy's cargo." Eric did as commanded and waited for his crew to stack the containers of contraband neatly on top of one another within one of the many cargo bays that existed on this heavy freighter. After they had finished, they shut the doors, allowing Eric to continue down to the planet, where more enemies undoubtedly lied in wait for them. After touching down on the surface of the moon, Drake entered the cockpit, where he gave Eric a fair warning regarding what was about to go down. "Alright, keep the engines running, and wait until I give you the signal to take off. Trust me, this is just the beginning. But you don't need to worry about us. We are skilled enough to take care of these fucking dregs." With this said, Drake and his crew departed from the freighter and headed towards the facility with their weapons in hand. Though Eric heard an exchange of gunshots, it was not long before Drake and his comrades came back to the freighter, where they carried several containers worth of contraband with their personal tractor beams. Eric waited patiently for some time as the crew filled up the entire ship with the contraband. It was only after there was no space left to carry the contraband that Drake came into the cockpit and gave some more advice to Eric. "Alright, you're going to take us to this space station in Imperial space, where we will sell our haul. I'm sure I don't need to inform you of this, but stay clear of the authorities. If we get caught with what we are carrying, it is a life sentence in a penal battalion for all of us. You understand?" Eric silently nodded his head and began to take off after charting the new coordinates into the freighter's nav computer. His heart was beating more so than he had ever experienced. Even after over 5,000 hours of active combat, Eric did not ever feel as anxious as he did now. The journey back to their destination was perhaps the longest, and most dreadful thing Eric had ever experienced, but, thanks to his knowledge of Imperial patrol routes, as well as the fact that most of the Empire's forces were currently engaged in the war abroad, Eric managed to make his way to the space station in question, where the freighter gently landed upon the platform. After which, the crew began to unload the cargo, where they then sold it to a criminal syndicate, who would distribute the illicit substance across the Empire. Once they had successfully earned their pay, the crew met in the mess hall of the ship, where Drake distributed the profits. Eric's eyes nearly jumped out of their sockets when he saw the number of credits transferred to his account. 5 million credits. He had more than enough to afford the starship he wanted. Hell, he could easily spend the remaining cash on some proper gear for himself, and upgrades to his ship. Just when he was about to ask how much the crew had made in total, Drake smiled as he grabbed hold of Eric's shoulder before explaining just what they had sacrificed for him to get such a massive payday. "There is a bit of a bonus thrown in for you, Apex. We had some time to talk while we were in the facility, and we had to admit, if it was any other pilot we could have hired, our gooses would have been cooked the moment we came across such a large number of hostiles. Not only that, but even I have no idea how you managed to so expertly avoid the authorities. The entire journey back, even when we were refueling, there was not a single Imperial warship anywhere near us. Thus, after a unanimous decision, we decided to sacrifice a bit of our pay to give you a bonus for your hard work. You more than earned it. I don't know who you are, but you are more than welcome to come back and pilot for us whenever we get our next job. Enjoy your fortune, Apex, because it sure disappears quickly. From here we go our separate ways. After a job like this, we are going to attract some unnecessary attention, and it would be best if we made ourselves scarce for a little. You can take a shuttle from the station back to Quadi, where I am sure our mutual friend is waiting for you. See you around the stars, kid." After saying this, the crew did exactly as Drake had said, and split up. Soon enough Eric was back in the industrial world of Quadi, where he met up with the sales representative Anna Paulson, who had an exciting smile on her pretty face as she welcomed Eric back to the store which she worked in. "You're back. I suppose this means the job went well? So tell me, are you still interested in a Hydra privateer?" Eric smiled as he nodded his head and in doing so accepted the offer that Anna had previously given him. "Good. I will get the transaction ready for you in just a moment." After saying this, Anna leaned in close and whispered something to Eric, yet again. "Oh, and by the way, now that you are a part of our world, Hydra has a special offer for you. For only an additional 500,000 credits, they will give you lifetime insurance. For whatever reason, if you manage to misplace your ship, or it becomes damaged beyond repair, they will give you a new one, no questions asked, and free of charge. Sounds great, doesn't it?" It was only now, after hearing this exclusive offer, that Eric realized the arms corporation known as Hydra Interplanetary, which specialized in starships and other vehicles for the civilian market, was actually heavily entrenched in the criminal underworld. Even then, he would not dare report such a thing to authorities, or else he would have to explain how he found out about this information. Thus, Eric smiled and nodded his head before accepting Anna's generous offer. Sounds good to me. With this said, Anna began to file the necessary paperwork. However, much to Eric's surprise, the information that would be sent to the Department of Transportation was under a pseudonym with other false information. Before he could question Anna if she had made a mistake, the attractive woman made a slight wink to him, silently conveying that this was Hydra's way of looking out for their exclusive clientele. Eric graciously accepted this offer, and was informed by Anna where he could get the proper identification documents attached to the name and address, which he immediately did after acquiring his ship. Thus, after a brief and dangerous mission, Eric had not only gotten his hands on his own personal starship, but had also gotten his first contacts into the criminal underworld, which he could use when he was not deployed to engage in any number of lucrative, but illegal, activities. Chapter 33, Visiting an Outlaw Outpost. It did not take long for Eric to get his hands on his personal starship. The Hydra privateer was a medium-sized vessel, which was capable of housing 4 crew members. It had a remote turret usable by the co-pilot, and 2-man turrets on the left and right sides. Aside from that, it had asymmetrical wings, which when landing were folded into the vertical position. The paint scheme that Eric had selected was jet black, with some red accents. Not only that, but the windows were tinted a blood red, giving off a menacing appearance. After stepping foot inside the starship, Eric realized that it was a very minimalistic and utilitarian design. However, unlike the warships he stepped foot upon, it was not the least bit polished, and was entirely rough around the edges, with exposed wires, components, and insulation across the vessel. The reason for this design choice was because Hydra Interplanetary primarily sold ships to those rogue elements who lived on the fringes of Imperial space, or even outside it. Thus, they had elected a bare-bones approach to ensure that self-maintenance was as efficient as possible. Ultimately, Eric had no complaints, as this starship was more than capable of fulfilling the tasks he required of it. Thus, after hailing the starport and requesting permission to take off, Eric had ignited the engines and slowly took off vertically with vertical thrusters. For a ship of this size, it took quite a bit of time to reach orbit, but Eric was more than used to such things, and thus once he was in space he spooled up the quantum drive, and marked his destination in his nav computer. The area of space which Eric was headed to was on the fringes of Imperial space, located within an asteroid belt within an uninhabited system on the borders of the Empire. Having used his new underworld contacts, Eric was able to locate the nearest outlaw outpost to his current location, which was embedded in a particularly large asteroid. The journey to the asteroid outpost took almost as long as the journey to the contraband facility that he had flown to during his previous underworld mission. After nearly 2 weeks of flying in space while alone in his ship, Eric finally arrived at the star system which housed his destination. Just like he was informed by Anna, this star system was completely devoid of habitable worlds. Its star was a blue supergiant, while the only worlds within the system were a series of large gas giants that were used to extract and refine fuel for quantum drives. In fact, other than the outlaw outpost which was hidden in the asteroid belt, there was only a single space station, a star fortress, and a comm relay which the Germanic Star Empire used in every system they owned. The space station, which orbited one of the larger gas giants, was used as an outpost for civilian miners who extracted the gas from the planets. But Eric had no intentions of stopping there and instead piloted his ship towards his destination which lay deep within the treacherous asteroid belt. Eric did not know how many asteroids were in this system, but it ranged anywhere from millions to billions and, if not for the influence of Hydra Interplanetary, which was given exclusive mining rights of this star system, then it was likely that the resources hidden among this asteroid belt would have been mined by large corporations long ago. Instead, Hydra's influence over the system allowed for the outlaw outpost to remain undisturbed by prying eyes. No doubt the megacorporation had bribed either the system governor, or the sector governor, for this purpose. Either way, Eric did not care, and instead navigated his way through the asteroid belt before finding his destination. Judging by the fact that his vehicle registration was unfamiliar to the syndicate which ran the outpost, a group of large railguns which were embedded in the primary asteroid, and those surrounding it, immediately targeted Eric's ship, before hailing him. Identify yourself. If you do not, we will open fire on you. Eric did not hesitate to give the name that Drake and his crew knew him by, as well as the identity of the woman who had vouched for him. My name is Apex, Anna Paulson sent me. The station was quick to respond, as they tried to verify whether or not Eric's words were true. They did not bother asking for his real identity, simply because so many outlaws chose to operate with pseudonyms for the sake of anonymity. Hold while we verify your credentials. Alright, you're clear to land in Hangar 09. After saying this, the railguns which were previously targeting Eric's ship disengaged, while the entrance to Hangar 09 slowly began to open. Eric skillfully maneuvered his new craft towards the entrance, which was just large enough to house his ship. If he slipped up by a few meters, his wings, which were now folded upright, would have clipped with the entrance. Upon landing in the facility, Eric did not take off his helmet which obscured his facial features. Instead, he boldly walked into the facility as if he was just another outlaw seeking a refuge. He could immediately tell upon taking the elevator to the lobby that this was indeed an outlaw's refuge. Nearly everyone in the facility was dressed in armor, and were carrying weapons that were clearly equipped with illegal modifications. Though the Empire permitted civilians to own weapons and armor, both on their person and on their ship, they did not sell things like power armor, plasma-based infantry weapons, or handheld rail guns to the public. Thus, the weapons and armor in the hands of the more veteran outlaws were essentially makeshift exoskeletons, power armor, and rail guns modified from more simple platforms. For Eric to show up in nothing but a flight suit, it was a clear indicator that he was just starting out in the criminal world. Which many people took notice of, yet nobody bothered approaching the newbie, or harassing him, as there was a certain honor among thieves, so to speak. After aimlessly making his way through the facility, while following the signs, Eric found himself in a small bazaar, where outlaws from all walks of life hawked their goods. Everything from drugs, bootleg alcohol, illegal weapons, etc., it could all be found here. Eric carefully observed each shop and was enticed by many of the offerings that were available. After seeing some weapons and armor that he thought were a much-needed asset in his new secondary profession, Eric decided that he would come back to those shops after he had made his primary purchase. If he had enough credits left over, then he would outfit himself with the best gear he could buy, and stash it away in his ship's armory. In fact, Eric just realized now that he did not even possess his own house, and the only place he would be able to store this illegal booze was in his starship, which had a decent-sized cargo bay. Perhaps it was best that for the time being he lived a nomadic life among the stars, as the ownership of property came with many taxes and responsibilities to the state. Eric approached the bootlegger who was selling the alcohol and was quick to interact with the man. While he spoke, Eric's voice was concealed by a feature of his helmet, which was common practice among those who dabbled in the criminal underworld. "How much for a pallet of your strongest liquor?" The hawker looked at Eric with a curious gaze, pondering whether or not his newest customer was an experienced drinker, or a complete novice. He quickly pointed towards a liquid which was glowing white before describing what it was. "If potency is what you are looking for, then look no further. This is Rylonian ale. Don't let the name confuse you. This stuff is brewed with a certain flower from the Rylonian homeworld, which has a powerful psychedelic effect on the Germanic mind. I warn you, one shot of this stuff will put you on your ass for hours on end. Normally I would charge 35,000 creds for a full pallet of 500-750 milliliters bottles, but in case you have been living under a rock for these past few years, Rylonia has been completely wiped out by the Naraku. Which means these bottles are the last that I will ever be able to get my hands on. Right now I'm charging a premium for just one bottle, and there is no way I am willing to sell a whole pallet to one customer, no matter how much you are willing to pay. So, I would suggest if you're looking for quantity instead of quality, but are still looking for a drink that packs a punch, then might I suggest a Juran palm wine? It lacks the psychedelic effect of Rylonian ale, but even the most experienced drinkers can barely drink 2 fingers worth of this stuff without passing out. In my honest opinion, it is definitely the best bang for your buck, if that's what you are looking for." Although Eric wanted to try out the Rylonian ale, which had now become a delicacy throughout the galaxy, he could not afford the price that the bootlegger was asking for just one bottle of the stuff. Thus, he was quick to inquire about the Juran palm wine. "How much for a pallet of the wine?" The man instantly raised 2 fingers, which Eric correctly assumed meant 20k, and just when he was about to accept the offer, the hawker began to speak once more. 20,000 creds, and it's yours. I can even have it hauled into your cargo bay free of charge. I would normally charge a full 25k for a pallet, but seeing as you're a new customer, and from what I can tell, are definitely suffering from shell shock, I'll give you a first-time discount. Eric raised his brows, which were concealed by his helmet's tinted visor after hearing the man's last remark. Shell shock? He did not believe he was suffering from such a condition, and was quick to ask why the man assumed he had been. "What do you mean? Why do you think I have shell shock?" The bootlegger did not hold back his punches and quickly fired back at Eric about why he was so certain the man was suffering from such a horrific condition. "It takes one to know one. I'm guessing you just got out of your mandatory military service. In that case, trust me, you are not alone. Nobody buys a pallet of this stuff unless they are either trying to drink their trauma away, or are trying to sell it for a higher price, and judging by the fact that you don't know shit about alcohol, I can assume you are going for the former. Since I know what you are going through, I figured I would cut you a break. I've heard from my contacts in the Navy that the Admiralty is working the current crop of soldiers to the bone in this war with the Drakians. I don't know why they have chosen to go with such methods, but I'd be willing to put my money on the idea that your last deployment was in this ongoing conflict, am I right? Eric was left speechless by this man's deduction abilities. He had not even said a word about himself, and already this bootlegger was able to determine so much about him. He was hesitant to respond, but for whatever reason, he sighed before admitting to it. First Armada, 13th Fleet. Though Eric could not see behind the man's skull-shaped helmet, he could tell by the way the man moved upon hearing Eric's confession that he was truly staggered by this statement. Which was confirmed the next second when Eric heard a long suction of hair before the hawker finally spoke. Shit. You were in the First Armada? From what I have been told, you guys have been tossed into the meat grinder. Damn kid, have a bottle of Rylonian nail on me. You deserve it after what you have been through. Me personally, I served in the Lycarian War as a Star Marine. Though those Lethoid bastards had far more advanced tech than the Dravkians, they did not put up nearly as much resistance. After all, that was a simple proxy war waged between the Dominion and the Federation. Neither of us were fighting for our survival like the Dravkians currently are. Still, I have no idea why the Admiralty is pushing our troops so hard in this current war. It doesn't make sense to fight so desperately against an enemy that we can easily defeat in a matter of years without sacrificing 1 out of 10 of the manpower and resources we have already lost so far. Still, the fact that we are fighting in such a reckless manner is a bad omen. In fact, after I have sold the rest of my wares here, I'm going to take an extended vacation to the Great Ana Empire. After all, their women are both beautiful and quite fond of Germanic men. Not only that, but the Ana worlds are far away from whatever threat is making the Admiralty behave so impulsively. I recommend you do the same when you have concluded whatever business is keeping you here in the Empire. Good luck, kid, and enjoy the wine. After saying this, the bootlegger handed Eric a bottle of Rylonian ale, where he immediately got into a cargo lift which carried the pallet of Ajuran palm wine into Eric's cargo bay. Once Eric had concluded his business with the alcohol merchant, he doubled back to the weapons and armor stands where he purchased some makeshift power armor and illegally modified railguns. He then took off and headed back to the industrial world of Guadi, where the First Armada was still undergoing repairs. Chapter 34, Taking hostages. During the 2 weeks that it took Eric to return to the industrial world of Guadi, he had experienced the best sleep that he had been able to obtain in nearly a year. Thanks to the intense effects of the Ajuran palm wine, Eric had managed to sleep in his rather rudimentary cot within the captain's quarters of his ship as if he were a fat drunken baby. By the time he arrived in the atmosphere of Guadi, Eric felt fully rested for the first time since the Dravkian War had begun. And though the effects of shell shock still lingered in his mind, Eric was able to perform his duties to the extent he was required. Officially, he still had 2 months left of his ongoing leave of absence from the Navy, and thus, he found himself debating on how he should spend his free time. After a day of nothing but drinking, Eric came up with 2 ideas. One was to unlawfully flee from the Empire's borders, and enter Ana space for a brief vacation. However, after calculating just how much time it would take to visit the Great Ana Empire and return to Imperial space, he quickly dismissed this idea. Instead, Eric decided on pulling off another job for whatever underworld faction was willing to pay him the most. After searching through his new underworld contacts, Eric found a syndicate known by the name of Splinter that was looking for a pilot to transfer some contraband from Imperial space to an interstellar civilization that was classified as a minor power which lies somewhere between the Empire's border and that of Ana space. The job required his ship to have a certain cargo capacity, which his privateer was more than capable of meeting, and was paying 500k for a simple delivery job. And while he would have to avoid the authorities from both civilizations, Eric was confident that he could manage just that. Thus, after calculating the distance between himself and his destination, as well as the time it would take to get there and back, Eric realized that he would have enough time to make the journey, and spend 3 days' worth of vacation on one of the alien worlds. Which, after doing some research, he learned that the home world of the alien species was a tropical paradise. With this in mind, Eric accessed the underground network, under the alias of Apex, and accepted the job. Where he would have to head to a nearby space station which was on the way to his final destination and covertly pick up the contraband before smuggling it into the borders of the neighboring civilization. It took only a few hours for Eric to land at the space station, where he immediately headed to the bar of the facility, which was the destination he was supposed to meet his contact at. After sitting down at the bar and ordering himself a liter of beer, which was his legal limit for the day, Eric waited patiently for his contact to arrive. Contrary to what he was expecting, the person who sat down next to him, and began to speak to him, was not a burly or battle-hardened man like the outlaws he had experienced so far, but was a beautiful mutant woman, with a particularly busty figure, cobalt hair, and scarlet eyes. Despite having a scar across her right eye, this only added to her attractiveness. The words she spoke were slightly hushed, but not obviously so as she began giving Eric his instructions. "I'm assuming you're Apex?" Eric was about to nod his head when she interrupted him. "Don't move a muscle, and don't you dare look at me. As we speak, your cargo bay is being filled with the product. Don't ask what it is, as it is not your job to know. All you need to do is to transport the cargo to Vaxcorvia, where your contact will be waiting for you at the following coordinates. Your contact will take the cargo from your ship, and will transfer the balance to our account, where we will pay you the agreed amount. Enjoy your trip. Oh, and whatever you do, don't sleep with the Vaxcorvian women. I don't know what kind of weird shit you may or may not be into, I'm not one to judge, but if for whatever reason you are attracted to amphibian humanoids, trust me when I say that your dick will melt off if you try to fuck one of those things. And before you ask, no, the syndicate will not pay for your medical fees if you are so daring. So unless you want to waste your paycheck, I suggest you follow my advice." After saying this, the woman chugged a liter's worth of beer in a matter of seconds before exiting the facility. Once Eric had finished his own drink, he entered his starship to find that his cargo bay was filled with what he could only assume was drugs. Eric climbed into the pilot seat, and started up his engines, before requesting permission from the space station to take off, which once gaining approval, he then activated his quantum drive, before following the route that his nav computer had set for him. It would take Eric a little under a month to reach his destination, as well as make his return to Quadi. He would only have 3 days of relaxation on the Vaxcorvian homeworld before he had to head back to the Empire. Thus, he planned to enjoy some time on the sandy beaches before he was once more forced to pilot a starfighter into battle. The journey to Vaxcorvia was quite dull. He was all alone in the 55 meters long ship that was the Hydra privateer, and thus all he could really do was entertain himself with the Azuran palm wine that he had transferred from his cargo bay and into the mess hall of his ship, while watching the latest news about the ongoing war with the Dvrakian Consortium. With each passing day, the Germanic armed forces gained more ground against the enemy, and it was beginning to appear that the war might even be over by the time Eric returned to active service. If that was the case, then he honestly did not know how long it would be before he was able to see combat again, which was something that filled his heart with hope. Eventually nearly a month had passed, and Eric had landed on the tropical paradise that was Vaxcorvia. The world was 90% ocean, and because of this, the amphibian species which inhabited it lived primarily in underwater cities. However, for the sake of interstellar trade, they had built cities on what little land their homeworld had, as well as space stations in orbit. It was abundantly clear by the level of technology that Eric saw aboard the Vaxcorvian vessels that they were perhaps even inferior to the Dvrakians when it came to military technology. Which was not a surprise, as the Vaxcorvian collective just barely qualified as a minor power with only 100 star systems and habited worlds under their control. Eric used the universal translator on board his ship to request permission to land within the planet's primary starport, which, once approved, he managed to do so with relative ease. However, despite the fact that things had been relatively smooth sailing up until this point, his luck appeared to have run out. Waiting in the hangar bay for Eric was a group of customs security officers who appeared to be heavily armed, as if tipped off about potential criminal activity. Upon seeing this on his ship's security system, Eric quickly ran throughout his ship's interior, and entered the armory, where he found the equipment he had purchased at the Outlaws outpost well over a month ago. Since he did not have time to equip his makeshift power armor, or the desire to go out guns blazing into the hangar bay of an interstellar spaceport, Eric had quickly grabbed hold of a revolver which had been illegally modified into a railgun, one which was affectionately nicknamed the hand cannon by those who wielded it. The railgun revolver had a 1x reflex sight mounted on the top rail, with a weapon light and visible laser combination device on the bottom rail. All in all, it was a solid option to carry with you when you needed to be less overt. After ensuring that the weapon was loaded, Eric stashed it on the back of his belt before approaching the cargo bay, which was now being surrounded by the Vaxcorvian security officers. After opening up the ramp, Eric walked into the open with his hands raised, before using the universal translator in his helmet to speak with the officers who were pointing their ballistic weapons at him. Whoa there. Everyone just calm down. I don't know why you guys have decided to show up to this hangar fully armed, but I can assure you that I have received permission by your customs department to bring my cargo into your world. The amphibian humanoids looked almost like a mixture of human beings and frogs, as they continued to aim their sights upon Eric. The officer in charge stepped forward and reached out his hand before speaking in his native language, which was translated to Eric via his helmet's functions. Passenger and cargo manifest. Upon hearing this, Eric reached into a nearby container at the aft of the cargo bay which contained the falsified documents that the Germanic syndicate known as Splinter had forged for him. The Vaxcorvian security agent who was in charge scanned the digital manifest with his eyepiece before handing it back to Eric. Just when Eric thought he had gotten away scot-free, the agent in charge made a shocking demand of Eric, which immediately put him on high alert. I have orders to check your cargo for any contraband. Move aside and allow my agents to fulfill their job. If you try to prevent us from doing so, I will have you charged with obstruction of justice." Eric sighed heavily. He knew for a fact that he was carrying some serious contraband, one which commanded such a high price that the syndicate which had hired him was willing to pay him 500,000 credits just to deliver it. Knowing that he would be facing criminal charges here in an alien civilization, as well as AWOL charges when he finally got back to the Empire, Eric backed away from the ramp, and leaned his back against the wall, seemingly allowing the security officers to check his cargo. While the officers began to break open his crates, Eric silently placed his hand on the grip of his railgun revolver, and cocked the hammer back. The audible clicks went entirely unnoticed by the officers who were too busy investigating his cargo for contraband. At the same time, Eric had managed to quite easily slice into the starport's primitive security system, where he put the camera feed on a loop, ensuring that nobody would come looking for him after what he was about to do. Within seconds the amphibian humanoids had found the drugs which Eric was smuggling into their territory. However, before they could officially react, Eric walked forward, and reached his arm around the commanding agent's neck while pointing his railgun revolver to his head, where he immediately voiced his demands while the other officers pointed their ballistic weapons at him. "Toss your weapons aside, and your eyepieces. Now walk away slowly. If I see even a single attempt on your part to call for reinforcements, I am blowing this bastard's brains all over my ship. Just like that. Nice and slow, nobody needs to get hurt here." The security officers did as they were instructed, and tossed their weapons away, while backing out of Eric's ship slowly. They then got on their knees, waiting for Eric to hand over his hostage. As for Eric, his heart was beating more rapidly than when he had done that job for Drake and his crew. As anxious as he was also high with adrenaline, as he used his nanites to connect to the Vaxcorvian interstellar network, where he called his contact, and in doing so, alerted the local syndicate about his ongoing situation. "Yeah, I'm here, Hangar 3 at the starport. You might want to do some investigating into your organization, because someone ratted me out to customs." Eric's contact immediately responded with several questions. "Are you alright? Have they seized the cargo?" Naturally, Eric began informing his contact of everything that went down, and after a brief summarization, silence prevailed for some time before the contact finally spoke. "Alright, I understand. My team is on the way. In the meantime, you must maintain control over the situation, and whatever you do, don't let those bastards call for reinforcements. When I find out who ratted you out to the authorities, I will skin them alive. I will also contact Splinter and have them investigate their own organization in case the fucking rat came from their end. Stay tight." With this said, the call was immediately cut, and Eric transitioned his full focus to the customs security team which he was now holding hostage in the middle of an alien starport. There was only one way to describe the situation that he now found himself in. Eric was truly and utterly boned. Chapter 35, Returning to active service. Eric took a deep breath as he aimed his railgun revolver towards his hostages. Naturally, his finger was off the trigger, as he was thoroughly trained in the use of firearms during his tenure in the Germanic Youth Corps, and later during his time at the Naval Academy. The last thing he needed was to cause a negligent discharge and alert the entire spaceport to his hostage crisis. The 5 customs security officers remained kneeling on the ground with their arms behind their head, as they eyed the security cameras, as if waiting for the starport's crisis team to respond. When Eric noticed this, he chuckled before informing the 5 men that their hopes were in vain. "I hate to break it to you guys, but reinforcements are not arriving. It was quite easy for me to slice into your security network and put those cameras on repeat. As far as anyone knows, you are still investigating my starship." Upon hearing this grave news, the hearts of the hostages nearly imploded. When they were tipped off about a potential drug smuggling ring, they did not expect things to end so poorly. They could only sigh and lament their lot in life as they waited for their fate to unfold. Shortly thereafter, Eric could hear the elevator functioning, and though the Vaxcorvians appeared hopeful that their saviors had arrived, the moment the doors opened they were filled with even further despair, as a group of fellow Vaxcorvians appeared on the scene. However, they were not dressed in security uniforms, but rather civilian clothes, with masks concealing their features. When they rushed into the hangar, these thugs drew their pistols which were concealed in their jackets, where they then approached the ship, while the leader of the unit spoke with Eric directly in the Germanic language. "The Glymex gang thanks you for your efforts. Do not fret, now that we have the cargo, the payment is already been transferred to Splinter as we speak. You did good, not many smugglers could handle a sudden search and seizure this well. We'll take it from here." Eric sighed in relief as he lowered his railgun revolver and placed it in its holster after decocking its hammer. All the anxiety he felt prior to this moment suddenly disappeared, and instead a wide smile formed on his handsome face, though it was obscured by the tinted visor that his helmet made use of. Just when he was about to express his gratitude, the gangster in charge attached a suppressor to his pistol, before shooting the leader of the Vaxcorvian security agents, point blank in the head. Eric had not expected that the gang who he was smuggling drugs to would outright execute his hostages, and he was quick to scream out at them in disbelief. "What the fuck are you doing?" The gangster simply snorted in disdain as the rest of the Vaxcorvian security officers ran for their lives. However, they did not make it far, as the gangsters ceased their actions and aimed their handguns at the hostages' backs before pulling the triggers, and thus sending all the remaining hostages straight to the afterlife. After doing so, he responded to Eric's question with a cold tone in his voice. "No witnesses." Eric could not believe his eyes. The murders had happened so quickly that he had not been able to intervene. Instead he fell to his knees, knowing that he was responsible for the deaths of 5 innocent security officers who were just doing their job. When he entered the criminal underworld, Eric had justified the murders that Drake and his crew committed, because they were Germanic citizens, and criminals no less, who were well within the range of cloning facilities. Those men had revived, and were most likely currently facing prison stints for the list of charges they were no doubt wanted for. But clearly the Vaxcorvians did not have the technology to bring their dead back to life, and thus, the 5 men who were murdered just now were well and truly dead. Killing in war was one thing, after all, it was a fight for Eric's survival. It was him, or the enemy, but to witness the outright murder of several security officers happen in front of him, which was undoubtedly his own fault. Eric felt a part of him die inside and realized immediately that he was not cut out for the cutthroat business of drug smuggling. The lead gangster could sense Eric's despair, and thus he pointed his pistol towards Eric's head, before asking one simple question. One which undoubtedly would determine whether Eric would live or die. "Are we going to have a problem?" Realizing that he might die without the chance of resurrection in a cloning facility due to the distance between him and the Empire's network, Eric quickly shook his head, before climbing to his feet while finding his resolve to stomach this heinous crime that was undoubtedly a result of his own actions. After seeing that Eric was being cooperative, the gangster chuckled before stashing away his pistol. He then ordered his crew to put the bodies in Eric's cargo bay once all the contraband had been successfully transferred into their hands, where he gave one last bit of advice to Eric who was struggling to keep his ship together. "When you enter FTL, you should dump those bodies out of your cargo hold. Trust me, nobody will ever find them that way. Oh, and one last thing, I don't believe I need to remind you that we were never here." After saying this, the Glymex gang departed with the drugs, which they would no doubt distribute across Vaxcorvian space. As for Eric, he climbed into his ship and took off with lifeless eyes. It took everything he had to properly dispose of the bodies which lie in his cargo bay without having a mental breakdown. No longer feeling up for a vacation on the beach, Eric immediately began to head back to the industrial world of Guadi, where he spent as much time as possible cleaning off the bloodstains from his cargo hold. Another month passed, and before Eric knew it, he was already back in Imperial space. The memories of what he had done on Vaxcorvia had never left his mind. Only the mass quantity of Azuran palm wine which he kept in his ship could help him tolerate the guilt that ate away at his stomach. When he finally pulled into Guadi's orbit, he spoke to himself in a depressed voice. It wasn't supposed to be this way. Despite the internal conflict that he was currently suffering from, Eric knew that he needed to put on his game face, or else when he re-entered active duty within the next 3 days, his fellow pilots would realize that something had happened, and he would undoubtedly be investigated. Thus, Eric forced himself to appear stoic, knowing that his freedom depended on it. The next 3 days were difficult to get through, as Eric primarily stayed within the confines of his starship, drinking wine to cope with the many disturbing emotions he felt at this moment. In the end, he stashed his ship away for long-term storage, before heading back to the carrier which he served on. It had only been 4 months since he was last fighting in Dvrakian space, and yet, he felt as if a lifetime had passed. His brief foray into the criminal underworld, while exciting at first, had ended with a bloody mess. Something which even now he endured a tremendous amount of guilt over. Meanwhile, the war against the Dvrakian consortium was quickly approaching its end. Something which Eric was immediately reminded of when he met up with his unit. Commander Erwin Wolf, who was in charge of the squadron, gazed upon the pilots of the Black Sun, and smiled before welcoming them back to service. "It is good to see all of us together again. Now, as many of you already know, the war is rapidly nearing its end, and all that is left is to lay siege to the Dvrakian homeworld. Thus we will immediately be deploying to the front lines to lead the charge against the enemy. Silver, you'll be glad to know that your interceptor has been replaced, though I would feel remiss if I did not remind you to take it easy on the stims, and that goes for the rest of you adrenaline junkies as well, understood?" Eric, along with the other pilots who had crashed as a result of overdosing on stimulants, immediately saluted their wing commander and responded in the affirmative. "Yes, sir." With this said, Commander Wolf smiled once more before giving out his orders to his unit. "Alright, well, now I want you fuckers ready for combat at a moment's notice. You all received a minimum of 4 months' leave, And the last thing I need is for you to get complacent. So, over the next few weeks, as we approach the front lines, I want you guys running combat drills on the regular. That's all for now. Dismissed. Eric followed the rest of his fellow pilots back to the bunks, where he stashed away his gear. Undoubtedly there would be another illegal card game tonight, but by now Eric had received his fill of unlawful activity, and decided to just get as much rest as possible before he was once more thrust into combat. In another sector of Imperial space, the cobalt-haired woman who was Eric's contact within the criminal syndicate most commonly known by the name of Splinter was standing before a man, who was dressed in a full set of power armor, but this was not the kind of power armor that had been illegally modified from more conventional sets of body armor like the one Eric owned. No, this was a genuine suit of Star Marine armor that had been scavenged from a raid against Imperial security forces. Despite the fact that this was a genuine set of power armor, it was cosmetically modified with the skull and bones of a large bovine-like creature that was found on a multitude of alien worlds outside of Imperial space. The creature had a particularly violent and dangerous reputation, and its remains were prized among hunters from multiple interstellar civilizations. Not only was the armor decorated with bones, but it was also painted in a rather haphazard pattern whose markings almost appeared random in design. The cobalt-haired woman's scarlet eyes glowed, as a data stream reflected from her irises. In this data stream was the naval profile of a certain man, one who had recently conducted a job for her criminal organization. With a cold and collected voice, the woman read the information from the data stream aloud. Lieutenant Eric Silberjäger, recently assigned to the legendary Black Sun Squadron, where for the past year he has been performing combat duties as the spearhead of the GSE's invasion of the Drakian Consortium. The man has been awarded the Iron Cross First Class for his actions during the Battle of Thuricles at the onset of the campaign, but despite his astonishing record of kills as an ace pilot, it appears that his career in the Imperial Navy has been stifled by the admiral in charge of the 13th Fleet, who was quite angry with Eric for the controversy he caused when he assaulted a female reporter. It doesn't help that several months later he crash-landed on the hangar bay of his carrier after overdosing on stimulants, and in doing so caused some minor damage to the ship. A voice which had been modified by a modulator spoke in a way that resembled that of a robot, as the man in the power armor quickly raised his hand and halted his subordinate's report. Mirage. I don't give a damn about his military service. In case you haven't forgotten, literally every man in the Empire is required to serve in the armed forces, myself included. This kid was recommended by Drake and his crew, and shortly thereafter, our smuggling operations were leaked to the authorities. I need to know if he is working for anyone else. What connections does Apex have to the party that might suggest he is an undercover agent? The look on the face of the woman who went by the alias of Mirage after hearing her boss's words was like that of a woman who had just walked into a sulfur pit. She did not approve in the slightest of being spoken to in such a rude manner, but she did not have the guts to reprimand an underboss of the syndicate. Thus, she could only respond passive-aggressively as he answered the man's questions. Well, Butcher. The only thing I can find that is remotely similar to your request is that this kid is the son of a sector governor. However, he was disowned by his parents for whatever reason shortly after joining the Naval Academy on Germania. I could not find the exact reason behind it, no matter how badly I tried to search for an answer, but I do have some clues. It happened almost immediately after the pop sensation Eric Krieger lambasted him on social media for a picture he had taken with a member of the Kondo dynasty, leading me to believe that his parents believed the rumors of him sleeping with the Ana woman and thus expelled him from their family in an act to save face. After hearing this, the man nicknamed Butcher remained quiet for several moments as if he were deep in thought. After a while, he took off his helmet, and took a deep breath of the purified air that was filtered through his carrier's life support system before speaking his thoughts on the matter. Despite your background as a former agent in the Imperial Intelligence Services, you are telling me that this kid has no connection with the authorities other than his father, who just so happens to be a high-ranking politician. Was Apex really just disowned by his parents for fucking an alien whore and left with nothing? Did this boy really turn to a life of crime just to support himself? Why does this story sound so familiar, Mirage? It was only after saying this that the man turned around to reveal his heavily scarred face. Like Eric and Mirage, he too was a mutant, one with blood-red hair which was cut into the style of a mohawk. His battle-worn face had a distinctive tattoo beneath his right eye, which was no doubt applied during a stint in a prison colony, as tattoos were only worn by those members of Germanic society who were a part of the criminal underworld. With a heavy sigh, Mirage responded to her boss with a melancholy tone in her hyper-feminine voice. It is what we as mutants have to do to survive. We are not allowed to marry or have children, so we turn to the arms of other mutants, or even aliens, for comfort. While the party expects us to fight and die for the expansion of their power and influence, they throws us to the wolves after we are no longer of any value to them. Where most of us turn to a life of crime in order to sustain ourselves. Apex's story is one as old as the Empire itself. It is of my professional opinion that he is not the rat, and thus you have no reason to act against him. No, whoever informed the Vaxquarian authorities about our business was definitely an insider. So you best turn your intention inwards, because from what I hear, after the way his last job ended, Apex is already considering returning to the life of a law-abiding citizen, but in 20 years, when his mandatory military service is completed, he will realize that he has no other choice but to come crawling back to us. Butcher did not respond for several minutes. Instead he stared out of the window with his arms held behind his back, as if in deep contemplation. After some time, he finally spoke again, and in doing so gave his orders to his right-hand woman. "All right, I believe you. I want this rat found and made an example of. If it turns out that he is a part of our outfit, then we better find him before the other underbosses do so, or God forbid, the boss himself does. As for Apex, leave him be for the time being. And when the boy finally realizes that no matter how good of a little soldier he is, that his fate was determined from the moment he was born, we will be waiting for him with open arms. After all, as a former ace pilot of the Black Sun myself, I know just how valuable of an asset Apex is to Splinter." Butcher shifted his gaze towards the window and remained silent. However, if one closely observed his reflection, they could see the data stream in his sanguine eyes, one which displayed a picture of himself, with a wife and kids. Something a mutant like himself should never have had. Chapter 36, The Battle of Dvrakia. It did not take long for Eric and the rest of the First Armada to arrive at the blockaded world of Dvrakia. What would have taken months for Eric's personal starship occurred in a matter of days for the massive warships of the Imperial Navy. After all, they carried significantly larger and more powerful quantum drives than a small expedition ship like the privateer. When the First Armada arrived back at the front lines, they saw that the world was under siege, and had been receiving an orbital bombardment by the entire Imperial Navy for God knows how long. Most of the world's structures were reduced to ruin, and its defenses were now nothing but trouble. Eric did not even have time to properly get caught up to date on the situation, because he and the rest of the thousands of pilots within the First Armada were immediately scrambled into action. After flying into Dvrakia's orbit, Eric got a much better understanding of just how devastated the world's surface was. Despite over a year of conflict, the Dvrakian consortium was still determined to fight until the last man. And though the Germanic armed forces had taken plenty of prisoners and conquered many worlds that had surrendered to them after bloody campaigns, it would appear that the home world of the Dvrakian species was determined to die with their sovereignty intact. Every single piece of military equipment that was still left in the consortium's hands was deployed in defense of the home world, with countless drones flying through the sky while combating the forces of the Germanic Star Empire. Eric skillfully maneuvered his interceptor, which was significantly faster and more agile than his privateer, through the atmosphere of the besieged world as he targeted every hostile ship his sensors could pick up. By now piloting his starfighter was more instinct than actual conscious thought. Thus, he nimbly avoided any and all enemy fire, whether it come from railguns or missiles, before locking on to his first target, and firing a missile towards the hostile drone. The missile exploded upon reaching the proximity of the target, and thus engulfed it in a massive explosion, leaving nothing left, not even a heap of scrap. Yet Eric did not celebrate. After all, it was just a drone fighter, and not an actual enemy pilot. Instead, he swiftly dodged an oncoming shot from another drone's railgun. While sweeping past the hostile drone, Eric fired a burst of his laser repeater, which shredded through the shields, and blasted the starfighter into smithereens. On the left and right sides of Eric's interceptor were two matching starfighters which were from members of his own unit, who fought alongside Eric as his wingman. As the trio shot down a multitude of drones, a voice came over the comms, congratulating Eric on his 3,000th kill. "Goddamn Silver, that is 3,000 kills now. Why don't you save some of them for the rest of us?" Eric simply snorted as he pressed his throttle forward, which propelled him and his interceptor further into the fray. After narrowly avoiding a missile which was fired towards him, via a combination of countermeasures and some skilled flying, Eric swept past the hostile aircraft and shot it down with his plasma cannon. His shot ate right through the primitive shields of the aircraft, and targeted its engines, which immediately exploded, and thus propelling what remained of the fighters straight into the ground, which crashed into a mostly destroyed building, bringing down what had previously survived the orbital bombardment. The battle continued to wage on for another 2 weeks, with Eric going back to his routine of getting very little sleep while maintaining a schedule of 22 full hours of combat. However, in the end, after the last vestiges of the Dvrakian resistance faded away under the intense onslaught of the Germanic armed forces, the president of the Dvrakian consortium capitulated. In an underground bunker on the Dvrakian homeworld, the president of the Dvrakian consortium and his surviving generals were in the middle of a call with Grand Admiral Lemrys from the Germanic Star Empire. Admiral Lemrys was a sharply dressed man, in a white and gold military uniform, which varied greatly from the uniforms which other servicemen within the ranks of the Imperial military wore. He had mid-length golden hair, and blue eyes, along with a strong jawline, and other masculine features. He was a rugged man, but a handsome one. When he activated the grid, his eyes would turn gold as a result of his nanite enhancements, which were cut above those which most Germanic citizens were injected with at birth. The man had a calm and collected appearance as his holographic projection was displayed in the bunker. Though his face was stoic, his voice was filled with wrath and disdain as he spoke to the enemy who had forced him to fight so bitterly for a little over a year. So, you finally realize now that you have no choice but to surrender. Quite honestly, you could have saved yourself some trouble by doing this a year ago when your allies abandoned you to your fate. Your armies are defeated, your worlds are now under my control, you have nothing left, and now you decide to speak about terms of surrender? Perhaps if I did not have other matters to worry about, then I would exterminate your race to show an example to the galaxy of what happens to those who resist our conquest. But I have plans for your pitiful species, and thus, those of you who have survived thus far will be permitted to live, as I rebuild what has been destroyed so that it is better than ever before. The Dvrakians now have the honor of becoming the first vassal of the Germanic Star Empire, and you should be kneeling before me, and thanking me for my benevolence. The Dvrakian president looked astonished when he heard what the Grand Admiral of the Germanic Star Empire had said. He could hardly believe his ears and stammered in disbelief. You're letting us live? Grand Admiral Lemrys nodded his head silently, thus raising the hopes of all the Dvrakians who were hiding in the bunker, until he spoke his next words. I have no choice. I need a buffer, and thus, the Empire will invest in the total reconstruction of your civilization so that every world may resist that which is about to come. Show us the same determination you had when you fought our forces, and you will be greatly rewarded. The moment the Dvrakian president heard these foreboding words, he once more began to stammer, this time out of fear, not disbelief. And what is precisely coming for us? Grand Admiral Lemrys did not hold back any punches as he responded to this question with a complete and honest truth. The Naraka Hive Fleet terminus is on a path headed directly to our borders. And, since you have wasted a year of our time, we now only have a little under 2 years left before they arrive in our sphere of influence. While the cowards from our political party have fled to Alfheim in search of refuge, the military of the Germanic Star Empire has decided to fight until the very last man. There will be no retreat, only victory or death, and you now have the honor of joining us in our heroic last stand. The president of the Dvrakian Consortium immediately felt like crying when he heard this news. Had he known that a Naraka Hive fleet was on a direct course for his borders, he would have voluntarily given up control of his nation's territory, and fled with as many of his people as he could towards the Anichian theocracy, who would have done their best to accommodate their vassals until they found a new place to call home. Instead, he had resisted the invasion of the Germanic Star Empire and was now nothing more than a puppet to be thrown into the meat grinder against the galaxy's greatest menace. In all honesty, he could not envision a worse fate for his people, who had already suffered so severely against the Germanic war machine. But he had no choice now but to accept the vassalage which the GSE was willing to bestow upon him. Thus, he ordered all of his remaining generals and admirals to bow before their new suzerain, as the fate of the Dvrakian race now laid in the hands of their new overlords. We would be honored to fight alongside you for the continued survival of our two species. Though the Dvrakian president said these words, he could not feel anything but the opposite. Still, after a little over a year, the war had came to an end, and though it had progressed longer than the Germanic Star Empire's admiralty had expected it would, they had achieved victory within a short enough time span that they could still muster a proper defense against Terminus and the horrors that lie in its hive fleet. In the world of Alfheim, Empress Lunaria Asterion sat on her throne. In front of her was the supreme leader of the Germanic Star Empire, who bowed before her with the most courtesy he could afford to give. The beautiful elven empress had a rather excited expression on her face, as she informed her lackeys about what the rest of their race had been up to over this past year. I am sure that you would be glad to know that your brethren have just concluded their war with the Dvrakian Consortium, and annexed the little devils into the Germanic Star Empire where, for the time being, they will be your people's first vassals. Curious, isn't it? I thought you Germans hated everyone who was not of your own race. Hell, even now I can see in your eyes the disdain you have for my people. I never would have thought the day would come where your empire permitted a conquered species to live. The winds of change have come at last. Supreme Leader Hanzap sweated profusely upon hearing the Alfheim Empress speak of the disdain he had for her. The anxiety he felt in his heart was visibly displayed on his face, to which Lunaria giggled like a schoolgirl before speaking in a rather heated tone, as if she were about to climax from the excitement she currently felt. What are you, nervous? Well, you shouldn't be. Part of what makes your people so tantalizing is just how cold you are towards everyone else, even your masters. The pride that your people have in your race, it is rare to see it be upheld in the face of overwhelming power. And while you might be nothing more than a pathetic dreg of your race who has fled in the face of death, I have no doubt that your Grand Admiral would be more than happy to stare me down, and spit in my face if I were to ever threaten him. Oh, the thought of it makes me so dreadfully excited. Supreme Leader Ep was not the only one who looked at the Alphaim Empress as if she had a screw loose. Even her own daughter, Princess Celestia Asterion, stared at her as if she had gone well and truly mad. The young princess could not help but voice her disbelief at her mother's scandalous words. Mother. Despite being chastised by her own daughter, Lunaria did not seem to care. Such was the confidence of a galactic overlord. Instead, she sighed heavily before dismissing the supreme leader of the Germanic Star Empire with a look of utter disappointment in her eyes. You can go now. I just wanted to tell you how bravely your people are fighting, even in the face of death. It was my hopes that perhaps their heroism would inspire you and your followers to return to your homeland to join their war for survival, but unfortunately it appears that I have overestimated you all. You lot truly are the dregs of your race. No wonder you all became politicians. After saying this, Lunaria motioned for her royal guard to escort the leaders of the Germanic Star Empire's sole political party out of her palace, and back to their embassy, where they would hide until the upcoming conflict with the Naraka Hive fleet was decided. Chapter 37, Instructing the new recruits. With the Dvrakian War having came to an end, the Germanic Star Empire immediately shifted its focus to a mass military buildup, as well as transforming their newly conquered worlds into fortresses.